Have you ever stopped to think about what it looks like when God's power moves through ordinary people in extraordinary ways? Tonight, you are about to hear the full story of two of the Bible's most remarkable prophets, Elijah, the man who called fire down from the sky, and Elisha, who performed twice as many miracles, from raising the dead to multiplying oil, from halting armies to cleansing lepers. Their interwoven stories show us God's faithfulness stretching across generations. As you settle in and drift towards sleep, let these timeless accounts of faith, courage, and divine action wash gently over you. But before we begin, if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button if this kind of content helps you relax. Also, drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from and what time it is there. We would love to hear from you. So, without further delay, let us get into it, shall we? A whisper on the wind. Desert winds carry stories across ancient hills. They move through valleys where shepherds once walked, over stones that still hold the memory of footsteps from long ago. In this land, caught between sea and wilderness, between promise and struggle, even the air itself seems to hold memory. The hills of Israel rise like sleeping giants beneath an endless sky. Olive trees twist their silver branches toward heaven, their leaves catching light that has shone over this place for thousands of years. Below, in the valleys, wheat fields stretch out golden in the morning sun. This is the land God promised to Abraham. The land Moses saw from a distance, the land Joshua took with faith and sword. But something has shifted in the spiritual air. The wind carries more than dust now. It brings the scent of burning incense, drifting up from foreign altars. The sound of chanting to gods with names like Baal and Asherah. The people who once walked with the God of Abraham now bow before carved images. They have forgotten the voice that split the Red Sea, the hand that fed them manna in the wilderness. King Ahab sits on his throne in Samaria, and the kingdom feels heavy beneath his rule. Not because of taxes or war, though those troubles exist as well. The weight comes from something deeper, a spiritual darkness that has settled over the land like fog creeping over a still lake. When people turn away from God, even the earth seems to hold its breath. In the palace, Queen Jezebel speaks with an authority that makes grown men step backward. She comes from Sidon, and she has brought with her the worship of Baal. Her voice carries the confidence of someone who has never once questioned her own will. Under her influence, altars to foreign gods multiply like weeds after rainfall. The prophets of the Lord flee to caves or fall to her sword. Yet heaven is not silent. In the courts of eternity, decisions are being made. Plans are already in motion. The God who spoke light into darkness is preparing to send his voice into this troubled time, not through armies or earthquakes, but through a man, a prophet, someone who will stand before kings and speak truth without flinching. The wind picks up, stirring the dust along ancient roads. It blows through the hills of Gilead, past the Jordan River, toward a destiny that will shake an entire kingdom. Soon, very soon, a figure will emerge from the wilderness, a man whose very name means, "My God is Yahweh." His footsteps will echo through history. His words will call fire down from heaven. But for now, the wind simply whispers through the valleys. The olive trees bend and sway. The wheat fields ripple like golden waves on a wide sea. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbles, though not a single cloud darkens the sky. The storm is coming, the stage is set, and God is about to speak. In the silence between one breath and the next, change begins. It starts small, like a seed pressed into good soil, like a whisper that grows into a shout, like a single raindrop that becomes a flood. The spiritual climate is about to shift. The sleeping kingdom is about to wake. The troubled kingdom. Israel should be a garden. Instead, it has become a wasteland of the spirit. Under King Ahab's 22-year reign, the nation has drifted far from the God who brought them out of Egypt. The drift began slowly, like a ship whose anchor slips quietly in the night. Now the distance between heaven and earth feels as vast as the desert itself. Ahab is not the worst king Israel has ever known, but he is weak where strength matters most. When it comes to his foreign wife Jezebel, he bends like a reed in the wind. She speaks, and he listens. She commands, and he obeys. What began as a political marriage has become a spiritual surrender. Jezebel arrives from Sidon carrying more than royal robes and jewelry. She brings with her 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. These servants of foreign gods eat at her table, sleep in her palaces, and spread their worship across the land. They build high places on every hill. They carve poles and statues. They light fires to gods who cannot see or hear. The people watch the king's wife and think that change is coming. If the palace worships new gods, perhaps they should too. Fear plays its part. Jezebel's sword has already tasted the blood of God's prophets. Speaking against Baal becomes dangerous. It is safer to bow with the crowd than to stand alone. Baal worship promises much. Fertility for crops, rain for thirsty fields, prosperity for merchants and farmers. The ceremonies are loud and wild, full of dancing and cutting and shouting. They offer an excitement that the quiet worship of Yahweh seems to lack. But promises and reality often walk very different paths. The true prophets of God hide in caves, like the 100 that Obadiah shelters, fed on bread and water in secret places. Some flee to other kingdoms, others choose death rather than bow to Baal. The schools of the prophets that once thrived in Bethel and Jericho grow silent. The voice of God seems as distant as stars on a cloudy night. Yet even in darkness, covenant promises remain. God remembers his word to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. The oath made to David still stands firm as bedrock. Though Israel wanders like a lost sheep, the good shepherd has not forgotten his flock. Discipline may come, but destruction will not have the final word. The covenant includes both blessing and curse. Choose life and live. Choose death and die. Israel has chosen poorly, and the consequences follow like shadows at sunset. Drought hovers on the horizon, like a promise no one wants to see fulfilled. The rains that should fall in their season wait for heaven's command. In the spiritual realm, battles rage beyond human sight. Angels of light war against powers of darkness. Principalities and authorities clash over the soul of a nation. What happens in palace and temple echoes in heavenly places. What is bound on earth reflects what is bound in heaven. Ahab sits in his ivory palace, surrounded by luxury purchased with spiritual compromise. His walls shine with expensive decoration. His tables overflow with fine food and wine. But prosperity built on faithlessness resembles a house constructed on sand. When the storms arrive, such buildings fall with great noise. The people go through the motions of their former faith. They still speak God's name, though quietly. They still remember the stories their grandparents told. Abraham's journey, Moses at the burning bush, David's songs. But memory without practice grows weak as winter sunlight. What is not used begins to die. Children grow up confused, learning prayers to Yahweh from their mothers and chants to Baal from their fathers. They see altars to both gods and wonder which one truly rules. The confusion spreads outward like ripples in still water, each generation more uncertain than the one before it. Yet God's purposes cannot be shaken. His plans unfold according to his own timing. In the councils of heaven, a decision has been made. A prophet will rise. A voice will speak. The spiritual tide that has run so long toward darkness will turn back toward light. The stage is set for confrontation. Heaven's patience has its limits. The time for gentle correction has passed. Now comes the thunder. Now comes the fire. Now comes the man who will stand before kings and speak the uncompromising word of the Lord. Enter Elijah the Tishbite. He appears without warning in Ahab's court, like lightning splitting a clear sky. No herald announces his arrival. No messenger prepares the way. One moment, the throne room holds its usual gathering of counselors and courtiers. The next, a stranger stands before the king of Israel. His clothes speak of wilderness and wind. His hair flows long and wild, touched by sun and storm. His eyes hold a depth that makes proud men look away. This is not a palace prophet, polished and careful with his words. This is something else entirely, something dangerous and uncontained. The guards step forward, their hands moving toward their swords. Who is this rough man who dares enter the royal presence without an invitation? But something in the stranger's bearing stops them. He carries an authority that has nothing to do with earthly power. When he speaks, even the air seems to listen. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the years to come, except at my word. The declaration falls like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of shock spread through the assembled court. Did this wild man just announce a drought to the king of Israel? His name is Elijah. Elijah the Tishbite, from Tishbe in Gilead. The meaning of his name carries its own prophecy. My God is Yahweh. In a kingdom where Baal is worshipped as Lord of storm and rain, this stranger declares the true God as his master. The challenge could not be any clearer. Ahab's face darkens with anger. But before he can respond, the prophet turns and walks away. No bow to royal authority, no request for permission to leave. He simply goes as suddenly as he came, leaving behind words that will echo through years of thirst and waiting. Elijah has spent most of his life east of the Jordan River, in the rugged country of Gilead. Here, where the desert meets the cultivated land, a man learns to depend on God for everything. Water comes from hidden springs. Food grows scarce in the rocky soil. Only the strong survive, and only the faithful truly prosper. The hills of Gilead seem to breed prophets like nowhere else. Perhaps it is the solitude that teaches men to hear God's voice. Perhaps it is the hardship that burns away everything except what truly matters. Or perhaps God simply chooses to speak more clearly in places where human noise grows quiet. Years of preparation have led Elijah to this moment. Years of learning to trust when circumstances make no sense. Years of discovering that God's ways rise as high above human ways as heaven rises above earth. The wilderness has been his school, solitude his teacher, faith his graduation. Now he carries a message that will test everything he has learned. Drought is coming to Israel, not the ordinary dry season that farmers know and plan for. This will be a drought beyond memory or hope. 3 years without rain, 3 years without dew, 3 years of watching the land crack and wither beneath a merciless sun. The message sounds harsh, but it carries hope within its severity. Rain will return at Elijah's word. When the prophet speaks, the heavens will open. The key to Israel's deliverance rests in the hands of the very man they will soon call their enemy. Baal's worshippers claim their God controls the weather. Storm clouds obey his voice. Lightning flashes at his command. Rain falls when he chooses to bless the earth. But now they will learn the difference between carved stone and the living God, between human imagination and divine reality. The drought will be Baal's test as much as Israel's. Let the rain god prove his power. Let his prophets call water down from heaven. Let his 450 servants dance and chant and cut themselves until blood flows like rivers. The sky will remain like brass. The earth will remain like iron. And Israel will learn who truly rules the forces of nature. Elijah walks away from Samaria knowing his life has changed forever. There will be no quiet return to Gilead now, no peaceful years tending sheep or growing grain. He has thrown down the gauntlet before the most powerful people in the kingdom. From this day forward, he belongs to the very storm he has announced. But he does not walk alone. The God who sent him into Ahab's presence will not abandon him in the wilderness ahead. Provision waits in places no human eye has seen. Protection exists beyond the reach of royal swords. The journey ahead will test his faith to its absolute limits. But faith that is tested becomes faith that is strengthened. Behind him in the palace, confusion reigns. Who was that wild man? Where did he come from? What did he mean about drought? Ahab's counselors whisper among themselves like leaves rustling in the wind. Only Jezebel remains silent, her eyes narrowed with thought. She recognizes a threat when she sees one. The die is cast. The prophet has spoken. Heaven's will has been declared. Now comes the waiting. Now comes the testing. Now comes the proof of which God truly reigns over storm and sunshine, over blessing and curse, over the destiny of nations. Ravens and a brook. God's voice comes clear as morning light. Leave this place and turn eastward. Hide in the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. Elijah obeys without hesitation. He has learned that God's instructions often make little sense to human wisdom. Hide by a brook after challenging the king. Trust ravens to provide your daily bread. The ways of heaven remain mysteries that faith accepts without needing to understand. The journey takes him through familiar territory. These are the hills of his youth, the valleys where he first learned to walk closely with God. Each stone seems to welcome him back. Each bend in the path holds memories of quieter days, when being a prophet meant only speaking to sheep and wild donkeys. Kerith ravine cuts deep into the landscape like a wound that has healed into beauty. Water trickles down its rocky walls, gathering into pools before flowing on toward the Jordan. Oleander bushes bloom in shades of pink and white along the banks. Fig trees stretch their branches over hidden springs. In a land about to burn with drought, this small corner of creation will remain as green as Eden. Elijah builds a simple shelter among the rocks, no palace walls to protect him here. No servants to attend his needs, just stone and sky and the sound of running water. The simplicity feels like freedom after the weight of royal courts and their heavy atmosphere of intrigue. The ravens come exactly as God promised, black wings against blue sky, carrying bread and meat in their beaks. They arrive morning and evening, as regular as sunrise and sunset, never too early, never too late, always enough, never too much. Heaven's provision operates with a precision no earthly kitchen could match. These are not ordinary ravens. God has commanded them, and they obey with perfect faithfulness. No storm keeps them from their mission, no predator frightens them from their task. They become living proof that all of creation serves its Maker's will. What seems impossible to human eyes appears completely natural to creatures who have never forgotten their place in God's order. Elijah drinks from the brook and eats what the ravens bring. The bread tastes sweet as honey. The meat satisfies like nothing he has known before. Not because the food itself is extraordinary, but because it comes directly from God's hand. Every single bite carries the flavor of divine provision. Days pass in a peaceful rhythm, morning prayer by the water's edge, afternoon rest in the shade of overhanging rocks, evening reflection as stars begin to appear overhead. The noise of the kingdom seems as far away as a half-remembered dream. Here, only the essentials matter: water, food, God's presence. Everything else falls away like leaves caught in an autumn wind. But this season of hiding is more than simply staying safe from Ahab's anger. This is schooling in trust. Every morning when Elijah wakes, he must believe that ravens will come. Every evening when hunger stirs in him, he must wait for wings in the sky. No storage rooms filled with grain here. No backup plans or emergency supplies, only daily dependence on God's faithfulness. The drought, he announced, begins to bite. Reports filter in through traveling merchants and refugees moving across the countryside. Wells dry up in towns he knows by name. Streams that have flowed for generations shrink down to muddy trickles. Farmers watch their crops wither in fields that once waved green with promise. King Ahab sends his soldiers searching through every cave and valley for the prophet who brought this curse upon the land. His spies question every traveler. His representatives offer rewards for information. But Elijah remains hidden like a stone resting in deep water. God's protection surrounds him like a wall no human can see. The brook continues to flow while rivers fail throughout Israel. Its water tastes clean and cold, even as dust storms blow across the dying land. The oleanders bloom while gardens everywhere wither. The fig trees bear fruit while orchards stand bare and lifeless. This one small corner of creation remains blessed while judgment falls on the nation. The ravens continue their faithful service. Morning and evening they arrive with provisions. Not a single day passes without their gifts. Even as food grows scarce throughout the kingdom, Elijah's table never lacks. The God who feeds the sparrows has not forgotten his prophet. Time moves differently in the ravine. Without royal schedules or priestly duties, Elijah learns to live by heaven's clock. He rises with the sun and sleeps beneath the stars. He prays when the Spirit moves and rests when peace descends. The artificial urgency of human kingdoms gives way to the eternal rhythms of God's presence. Yet he knows this season will not last forever. The drought serves a purpose far larger than his own safety. Israel must learn that Baal cannot bring rain. The prophets of false gods must face their own powerlessness. King Ahab must discover that political authority means nothing when heaven withholds its blessing. So Elijah waits beside the brook and trusts the ravens. He drinks from waters that flow by divine command. He eats bread that comes from heaven's storehouse. And he prepares his heart for whatever God will ask of him next. The storm is far from over. The testing of the kingdom has barely begun. But here, in this hidden place, God's prophet grows strong for the battles yet to come. The widow of Zarephath. The brook begins to fail. Day by day, the water level drops like hope in a drought-stricken land. The flow that once splashed cheerfully over rocks becomes a whisper, then a trickle, then nothing more than damp spots on sun-baked stone. Even God's special provision has its limits when heaven's judgment falls complete. Elijah watches the water disappear and waits for new instructions. He has learned not to panic when circumstances change. The God who sent ravens to feed him has not forgotten his promise. The silence before the next command carries its own kind of peace. The word comes clear as crystal. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow there to supply you with food. Sidon, Jezebel's homeland, enemy territory where Baal worship reaches its fullest expression. God is sending his prophet into the very heart of pagan darkness to depend on a woman who has never heard the name of Abraham's God. The irony carries a bitterness like wormwood on the tongue. While Israel's wells run dry despite their covenant privileges, a Gentile widow will be the one to provide for God's prophet. The journey takes several days across territory, growing more desperate with each passing mile. Refugees crowd the roads, carrying bundles of possessions and children too exhausted to walk another step. Dust covers everything like a grey shroud. The sun beats down with a relentless force, like a bronze hammer striking the anvil of a dying land. Zarephath sits along the Mediterranean coast, a modest town that survives on fishing and trade. But even here, far beyond Israel's borders, the drought has left its mark. Gardens lie withered and brown. Cisterns hold only bitter dregs. The sea provides some fish, but not nearly enough to feed a population swollen with refugees pouring in from the dying interior. Elijah arrives at the town gate, tired and thirsty. The sun stands high and hot above him. Dust fills his mouth and burns his throat. He needs water. But more than that, he needs to find the widow God has promised him. Among all the desperate people gathered in this desperate place, one woman has been set apart to care for heaven's messenger. She appears like an answer to an unspoken prayer. A thin woman gathering sticks near the gate, her movements are slow with hunger and weariness. Her clothes speak of poverty that has deepened into genuine desperation. This cannot be the woman God intended. Surely the Almighty would choose someone who had abundance to share. but the Spirit whispers confirmation quietly in Elijah's heart. This is the one. This widow with her bundle of twigs and her face marked by sorrow. God's ways continue to surprise even his most faithful servants. "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" Elijah calls to her. His voice sounds rough from days of dust and wind. The request seems simple enough, but water has become as precious as gold in these days of drought. The woman looks up, and her eyes carry depths of sadness that seem achingly familiar. She has buried her husband. She has watched her resources dwindle down to almost nothing. She knows the particular taste of fear that comes when the last handful of wheat sits at the bottom of an empty jar. Yet something in the stranger's voice compels her to nod and turn toward her small house. As she walks away, Elijah calls after her, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." She stops, as if struck by lightning. Slowly she turns back, and her voice carries the full weight of coming death. "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." The words hang in the air like a funeral song. This woman stands at the very edge of existence. The meal she is planning will be her last. After that, only starvation remains. Yet God has chosen her to feed his prophet. The divine logic continues to baffle every human attempt at understanding. Elijah's heart fills with compassion and faith in equal measure. He has learned to trust God's promises even when they seem impossible, especially when they seem impossible. "Don't be afraid," he tells her, his voice as gentle as rain falling on thirsty ground. "Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have, and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The woman stares at him as if she is seeing a vision. This stranger asks for her last morsel of food, and then promises that her supplies will never run empty. In a world where drought has made liars of all weather prophets, he speaks of miracles as naturally as he speaks of mourning. Something in his eyes convinces her. Perhaps it is the quiet authority in his voice. Perhaps it is desperation making any hope worth reaching for. Perhaps it is the gentle touch of God on her heart, whispering that this strange man speaks a truth beyond ordinary human understanding. She goes home and does exactly as Elijah said. She makes a small loaf from her handful of flour and her few remaining drops of oil. She brings it to the prophet waiting at her door. Then she returns to prepare what she expects to be the final meal for herself and her son. But the jar of flour is not empty. The jug of oil has not run dry. Where scarcity ruled only moments before, abundance now flows like a hidden spring suddenly discovered. The God of Israel has spoken, and his word never returns void. The son who died. Days flow into weeks in the widow's small house. The miracle of flour and oil continues without a single interruption. Each morning the woman expects to find empty containers. Each morning plenty remains. The God of Israel keeps his promises with a faithfulness that time cannot erode. Elijah settles into the rhythm of this unusual household. He sleeps in the upper room, grateful for shelter and the sounds of normal life drifting up from below. The widow's son plays in the courtyard, and his laughter is a sweet sound in a world grown harsh with drought. For the first time in many months, the prophet experiences something close to peace. The boy grows curious about their guest. Who is this man with the wild eyes and the gentle hands? Why does he spend so much time in prayer? What does he see when he stares into the sky as if reading letters written in the clouds? The child's questions flow like water from a spring, innocent and entirely endless. Elijah grows genuinely fond of the boy's quick mind and eager spirit. Here is a life unmarked by cynicism or fear. Here is trust that accepts miracles as easily as sunshine. The prophet finds himself telling stories of his homeland, of the God who speaks through burning bushes and parts seas with a single word. The woman watches their friendship growing with a quiet sense of wonder. Her son has been sad since his father's death, quiet in ways that worried her deeply. Now, laughter has returned to his voice. Hope has brightened his eyes. The strange man from Israel has brought more than miraculous food to their house. He has brought joy back from somewhere it had been lost. But then comes the morning when the boy does not wake for breakfast. His mother calls his name with growing alarm. She shakes his small shoulders, but his body remains still as stone. His breath has stopped. His heart beats no more. Death has crept into their house like a thief moving through the night. The woman's grief explodes into rage and raw accusation. She carries her dead child to Elijah's room and confronts him with eyes blazing like torches. "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Her words cut deeply because they give voice to the question that haunts every believer in times of inexplicable loss. Why does God allow suffering to touch the innocent? Why does death claim children while evil men live long and easy lives? If the Almighty can multiply flour and oil, why could he not protect a boy from sickness? Elijah feels the weight of her pain as though it were his own. This woman gave him shelter when he had nowhere else to turn. She shared her last meal without complaint. She trusted Israel's God on nothing more than a stranger's word. And now her son lies dead in her arms. "Give me your son," he says quietly. The words sound stark, but his voice carries infinite gentleness. The woman hesitates, then places her precious burden into the prophet's arms. The boy's body feels cold and small, like a bird fallen from its nest. Elijah carries the child to his own room and lays him carefully on the bed. Then he begins to cry out to God, with the full desperation of a man whose faith hangs by a single thread. "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" The prayer pours out with a raw honesty that holds absolutely nothing back. This is not the polite petition of formal worship. This is the anguished cry of a heart being torn in two. The prophet, who has seen miracles beyond counting, now faces the one miracle he fears most to request. 3 times, Elijah stretches himself over the child's still form. 3 times he cries out for life to return. "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The words echo off the walls like thunder in a sealed room. Nothing happens. The boy remains motionless. Death maintains its grip with fingers of ice. But Elijah continues to pray, continues to hope, continues to believe that the God who creates life from nothing can restore it to a small body, grown cold and still. Then, like dawn breaking after the longest possible night, warmth begins to return to the child's skin. A flutter stirs somewhere deep in his chest. His eyes open wide with surprise, as if he has awakened from the deepest sleep of his life. Breath fills his lungs with a sound like wind rushing through dry grass the moment rain finally comes. The boy sits up and looks around the room with a confusion that quickly gives way to joy. He is alive, completely, perfectly, miraculously alive. Death has been forced to release its hold. The impossible has become reality through the power of desperate, unrelenting prayer. Elijah lifts the boy in his arms and carries him down to his mother. "Look, your son is alive." The words feel insufficient for the magnitude of what has just happened, but they carry the full weight of heaven's victory over the darkest weapon in hell's arsenal. The woman takes her son and holds him as if she will never let go. Her tears fall like rivers, but now they carry the taste of joy rather than sorrow. She looks at Elijah with eyes that have seen beyond the ordinary veil of human existence. "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." Her declaration carries the authority of one who has personally witnessed resurrection. She has moved beyond belief into knowledge, beyond hope into certainty. This is the first time in all of Scripture that someone returns from death to life. The precedent set here will echo through all of history until another son dies and rises again, this time to stay. But for now, in a small house in Sidon, heaven has shown its power over the grave. The widow feeds her son and marvels at the miracle of his hunger. Elijah watches them both and feels his own faith made deeper and stronger by everything he has witnessed. The God who sends ravens and multiplies flour can also defeat death itself. No power in earth or in the depths of hell can stand against such love. The third year, silence has settled over Israel like dust collecting on an abandoned house. 3 years without rain, 3 years without dew, 3 years of scanning the sky for clouds that never arrive. The land lies cracked and broken, painted in shades of brown and grey that speak of death and desperation. King Ahab has aged well beyond his years. The drought has carved lines into his face deeper than any sword could cut. His kingdom staggers like a man who has drunk too much, weakening with each passing season. Cattle die in the fields. Horses grow as thin as skeletons. Even the palace wells run low, their water bitter with minerals drawn from increasingly desperate depths. Jezebel's prophets of Baal dance themselves to exhaustion, calling for rain. They cut their bodies until blood flows like the water they cannot summon. They shout until their voices crack like the parched earth beneath their feet, but the sky remains like brass, and their God remains as silent as stone. The people begin to whisper dangerous thoughts. Perhaps Baal is not as powerful as they were led to believe. Perhaps the old God of their fathers still watches over Israel, after all. Perhaps the wild prophet who announced this drought was telling the truth. But whispers are dangerous things when queens have sharp ears and even sharper swords. Famine stalks the land like a predator hunting wounded prey. The wealthy eat through their stored grain, while the poor gather roots and weeds from cracked soil. Children cry themselves to sleep with empty bellies. Old people sit in doorways with eyes that have witnessed too much suffering. Death becomes a frequent visitor to homes that once knew abundance. Foreign merchants avoid Israel's borders. Who wants to trade with a kingdom where water costs more than wine? Caravans take longer routes through more hospitable lands, and the economic isolation deepens the crisis, turning shortage into genuine starvation. Ahab sends his soldiers to search every cave and valley for the prophet who holds the key to their deliverance. They question travelers and refugees. They offer rewards for information. They issue threats against anyone hiding the truth. But Elijah remains concealed beyond human searching, protected by the same God who sent the drought in the first place. In the palace, counselors argue endlessly about solutions. Some propose raiding neighboring kingdoms for stored grain. Others suggest relocating the capital to a city with better water access. A few brave souls whisper that perhaps they should seek the God of Israel again. But those voices grow quiet very quickly whenever Jezebel passes nearby. The queen herself shows no visible signs of doubt. She maintains her lavish lifestyle while her subjects slowly starve. Her table is supplied with food brought in from distant lands. Her gardens stay green through water hauled by slaves from secret springs. If the kingdom suffers, that only proves the people lack sufficient faith in Baal. Yet, even Jezebel feels the pressure mounting. Her husband grows more difficult with each passing week, snapping at servants and brooding in silence for hours. The other kings of the region watch Israel's weakness with calculating eyes. Enemies smell blood, the way sharks sense a wounded swimmer in open water. Meanwhile, in Zarephath, Elijah continues his quiet exile. The widow's house has become an island of plenty, surrounded by a sea of want. The flour never runs out, the oil never fails. The boy grows strong and healthy, while children throughout Israel waste away from hunger. But the prophet's heart aches deeply for his homeland. He knows the cost of the suffering his words have brought. He feels the weight of every death, every tear, every empty stomach. The drought serves God's purpose, but its toll measures beyond any human calculation. Justice and mercy wage a quiet war in his spirit, like storm clouds gathering for battle. Prayer becomes his refuge during the long nights when sleep refuses to come. He speaks honestly to God about the people's suffering. He pleads for wisdom to know when the lesson has been fully learned. He asks for the strength to endure the burden of being heaven's instrument of judgment. The God who speaks through whirlwinds and earthquakes often communicates through silence. Elijah learns to find meaning in the quiet spaces between words. The absence of an immediate answer becomes its own kind of message. Wait, trust, the timing belongs to heaven, not to earth. Reports reach Zarephath through merchants and refugees making their way along the coast. Israel grows weaker with every passing month. Some of the people have begun to turn back to the God of their fathers, offering desperate prayers for rain. But most still bow to Baal, believing their suffering results from insufficient devotion to their new gods. The drought has accomplished part of its purpose. It has exposed the powerlessness of false gods. It has demonstrated clearly that carved wood and stone cannot command the forces of nature. But has it truly changed hearts? Has it driven Israel back to their first love? The answer remains as unclear as morning mist hanging over still water. Then, on an ordinary day that seems no different from 1,000 others, the word of the Lord comes to Elijah. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. The command falls like lightning into the stillness of his long exile. 3 years of hiding end in a single breath. 3 years of preparation come to their conclusion, and a new beginning opens before him. The drought will break, but not quietly. Not without one final and decisive confrontation between the prophets of Baal and the God of Israel. Elijah rises from his knees and begins to prepare for the journey. The widow watches with eyes that understand. Her son clings to the man who has become like a father to him in this season. They all know this departure is different from any before it. This time the prophet goes not to hide, but to reveal himself. Not to wait, but to act. The final act of the drought's long drama is about to begin. The stage is prepared for a confrontation that will echo through the ages. On Mount Carmel, under the watching eyes of all Israel, fire will fall from heaven and rain will return to the earth. But first, Elijah must walk back into the kingdom that has wanted him dead for 3 long years. Obadiah and the hidden prophets. In the palace of King Ahab lives a man caught between 2 worlds. Obadiah serves as governor of the royal household, entrusted with the daily operations of the kingdom. His name means servant of Yahweh, yet he works for a king who has turned away from the God of Israel. The contradiction presses on his conscience like a stone resting on his chest. Very few people know the secret that could cost Obadiah his life. While Jezebel's sword drinks the blood of God's prophets, while caves echo with the cries of faithful men hunted like animals, Obadiah has concealed 100 servants of the Lord in 2 separate groups of 50. He feeds them on bread and water, quietly redirected from the royal kitchens, risking everything he has to preserve a remnant of true worship in Israel. The operation demands careful planning and constant vigilance. Caves must be located that are deep enough to conceal 50 men, yet close enough for regular supply runs. Food must be diverted without raising suspicion. Water must be carried in vessels that will not be missed. One careless moment, one suspicious guard, one whispered rumor in the wrong ear could destroy everything in an instant. Obadiah moves through the palace like a man walking on ice he is not certain will hold. He attends meetings where Jezebel plots the destruction of God's prophets. He listens to reports about the ongoing search for Elijah. He nods at appropriate moments and keeps his expression carefully composed. But inside, his heart burns with the conflict between duty and faith. The hidden prophets know they owe their lives to this brave man. They pray for him without ceasing, asking God to protect their protector. They understand exactly the danger he faces every time he passes through the palace gates. One word from Jezebel could mean death, not just for them, but for the man who has shown them such costly and courageous kindness. The caves where they shelter become underground schools of faith. Older prophets teach the younger ones the songs of David. They recite the law of Moses from memory. They tell the stories of Abraham's journey and Joshua's victories. In the darkness of their hiding places, the light of God's truth burns as bright as stars scattered across a midnight sky. Obadiah's faith grows stronger through the constant pressure of his circumstances. Each successful supply run deepens his trust in God's protection. Each narrow escape from discovery reinforces his conviction that heaven watches closely over those who serve with undivided hearts. He learns through experience that courage is not the absence of fear, but faithfulness lived out in spite of it. The drought makes his mission both harder and easier in different ways. Harder because food grows increasingly scarce throughout the kingdom. Every loaf of bread becomes precious as gold. Every jar of water is counted and measured and carefully tracked. But easier, too, because the general chaos provides cover for unusual activities. In desperate times, people pay less attention when supplies happen to go missing. The royal household struggles just like everyone else. Servants work harder for smaller portions. Guards grow irritable from hunger and thirst. Even the king's table offers far less variety than before. Obadiah uses the resulting confusion to his advantage, redirecting resources with the careful skill of a man whose life depends entirely on precise planning. News reaches the palace regularly about the continuing search for Elijah. Ahab has sent official messengers to every neighboring kingdom, asking whether they have seen the prophet who brought this curse upon Israel. Some kings swear solemn oaths that they have not sheltered the wanted man. Others simply decline to cooperate, finding too much quiet satisfaction in Israel's distress to offer any assistance. Obadiah knows far more about Elijah than he could ever safely reveal. The hidden prophets speak of him with reverence and barely contained hope. They share among themselves the stories of his miracles, his courage, his uncompromising dedication to God's truth. To them, he represents everything they wish they could become. To Obadiah, he seems like a dream too extraordinary and dangerous to fully believe. The strain of his double life appears in small but telling ways. He sleeps poorly, always alert to footsteps in the corridor. He eats little, his stomach too knotted with worry to accept much food. His hair has gone grey at the temples, aged well beyond his years by stress and unceasing tension. Yet he continues his secret mission, because to stop would mean watching good men die when he had the means to prevent it. Jezebel grows more suspicious as the drought drags on into its second and third year. She questions her servants about supplies that cannot be fully accounted for. She watches for any flicker of disloyalty among her staff. Her eyes seem to follow Obadiah whenever their paths cross in the palace corridors. He forces himself to appear perfectly calm while his heart races like a bird caught in a narrow space. The queen maintains informants spread throughout the kingdom. Merchants, soldiers, even beggars report back to her about unusual activities in distant towns and villages. Her network of spies makes everyone deeply paranoid. Neighbors watch neighbors. Servants suspect fellow servants. Trust becomes a luxury that very few can afford in such dangerous times. But God protects his faithful servant with quiet precision. Time after time, Obadiah escapes detection by margins so narrow they can only be called miraculous. Guards turn away at crucial moments. Meetings run unexpectedly long, providing cover for supply runs that could not otherwise be explained. Storms blow in suddenly, giving him reasons to seek shelter in the vicinity of the hidden caves. The 100 prophets pray without stopping for their benefactor and for their broken kingdom. They fast and weep and intercede for rain to return to the dying land. They cry out for justice against those who shed innocent blood. They plead for God to remember his covenant with Israel and draw his wandering people home. Some nights Obadiah lies awake in the dark and wonders how much longer all of this can possibly continue. The hiding places grow harder to supply with each passing week. The queen's suspicions deepen daily. The prophets themselves grow increasingly restless, longing to emerge from their caves and declare God's truth openly to whoever will listen. The pressure builds steadily, like water rising behind a dam that may not hold much longer. Yet he perseveres, because he has already seen too much to consider quitting. He has watched ordinary men become something like heroes through their faith in impossible circumstances. He has witnessed the power of prayer to sustain life when every earthly resource has been exhausted. He has come to understand that God's strength shows itself most clearly through human weakness. The drought will end someday. Jezebel's reign will pass into history like all earthly powers before it. But the memory of 100 prophets preserved alive by one faithful man will echo forward through generations yet to come. The God who notices sparrows falling from trees has not overlooked those who risk everything to serve his purposes in the shadows. Morning comes to the palace again as it has for 3 years now. Without dew, without clouds, without the faintest hope of rain. But Obadiah rises and prepares himself for another day of dangerous faithfulness. The hidden prophets depend on him. God has called him to this work. And somewhere beyond the borders of Israel, Elijah still lives, holding in his words the key to his nation's deliverance. Confronting the king, the road back to Samaria stretches long and dusty under the merciless sun. Elijah walks through a landscape transformed almost beyond recognition by 3 years without rain. Where green fields once waved gently in the afternoon breeze, cracked earth now spreads like broken pottery scattered across the hills. Where streams once ran clear and cold, dry ravines hold only loose stones and bitter memories. The prophet's footsteps raise small clouds of dust with each step he takes. His face, deeply weathered by wind and sun, shows the marks of his long exile plainly. But his eyes burn with a purpose that has nothing to do with the fire blazing overhead. The time for hiding has ended. The moment for confrontation has fully arrived. As he travels, he passes refugees moving in broken streams toward other kingdoms. Families carry their remaining possessions bundled in cloth tied with rope. Children walk barefoot, their feet hardened by miles of rocky ground. Old people lean on walking sticks, their faces carved by suffering into masks of quiet endurance. They look at the wild-looking prophet with eyes that have somehow forgotten how to hope. Some among them recognize him from stories whispered around dying campfires in desperate villages. Is this the man who brought the drought? The one who spoke judgment over Israel and then disappeared like morning mist burning off a lake? They watch him pass with expressions that hold both fear and desperate curiosity. If he could bring the curse, perhaps he holds the power to lift it as well. Meanwhile, back in Samaria, King Ahab grows more desperate with each passing day. The royal stables hold only a few remaining horses, their ribs visible through dull and dusty coats. The palace gardens have become graveyards of withered plants. Even the palace fountains stand empty and dry, their carved decorations a mocking reminder of the water they can no longer provide. Ahab sends for Obadiah, his trusted household governor. The king's voice carries the weariness of a man who has borne too much for too long. Dark circles ring his eyes. His royal robes hang loosely on a frame, thinned by stress and poor eating. The crown itself seems too heavy for his graying head. Go through the land to all the springs and valleys, Ahab instructs him wearily. Maybe we can find some grass to keep the horses and mules alive, so we will not have to kill any of our animals. The request reveals how far the kingdom has truly fallen. The king of Israel is now personally organizing a search for grass to feed his livestock. Obadiah bows his acceptance of the mission, but his heart sits heavy with knowledge he cannot share. He knows where 100 prophets are hiding in caves, sustained by increasingly meager rations. He knows the drought continues because Israel has not genuinely repented. He knows that only God can bring an end to what God has begun. The two men decide to search in opposite directions to cover more ground efficiently. Ahab takes one road, while Obadiah takes another. The irony bites with quiet sharpness. The king who has abandoned God searches for natural solutions, while his faithful servant walks roads that are about to lead toward a divine answer no one could have anticipated. Obadiah has not traveled far when he sees a solitary figure approaching from a distance. The man's silhouette wavers in the heat like a mirage forming over baked stone. But as the figure draws closer, recognition strikes like a physical blow. The wild hair, the weathered clothing, the unmistakable bearing of someone carrying both authority and deep humility. This can only be Elijah. The household governor's first instinct is to turn and run. Encountering the most wanted man in Israel on a lonely road feels like a trap arranged by some cruel hand of fate. But something in the prophet's approach suggests purpose rather than coincidence. This is no accidental meeting. This is a divine appointment. Elijah stops a few paces away and speaks first. "Is that you, Obadiah?" His voice carries a warmth that genuinely surprises the frightened official. No anger colors his words, no accusation darkens his tone. He speaks like a man greeting an old friend rather than confronting a representative of his enemies. Obadiah falls to the ground before him in a mixture of reverence and profound terror. "Yes, my lord, it is I." The words emerge barely above a whisper. He cannot look directly at the man whose spoken words have brought such sweeping judgment down upon the land. Yet he cannot bring himself to run from someone who so clearly serves the God he loves. "Go tell your master, Elijah is here," the prophet instructs him simply. The command sounds straightforward enough, but both men understand what it truly means. Telling Ahab about this encounter will expose Obadiah to royal suspicion immediately. Why was he speaking with the kingdom's most wanted fugitive? How did he recognize him so readily on a deserted road? Obadiah's response reveals the depth of his fear and the honesty of his heart. "What have I done wrong, that you are handing your servant over to Ahab to be put to death?" His voice shakes visibly, like leaves caught in a sudden gust. He knows Ahab's temper intimately. He knows Jezebel's cruelty even better. Any association with Elijah could mean execution not just for him, but for everyone connected to his household. The faithful servant continues speaking, his words tumbling out in an urgent stream, revealing in the process information that genuinely surprises even the prophet before him. "As surely as the Lord your God lives, there is not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you. And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed you were not there, he made them swear they were telling the truth." The scale of the search takes even Elijah aback. Ahab has turned the hunt for one solitary prophet into an international diplomatic matter. Foreign kings have been compelled to swear formal oaths concerning their knowledge of his whereabouts. The drought has made finding Elijah a matter of royal urgency, reaching well beyond Israel's own borders. But Obadiah is not yet finished speaking. His next words reveal the secret he has protected with his very life. "I, your servant, have worshipped the Lord since my youth. Haven't you heard, my lord, what I did while Jezebel was killing the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and I supplied them with food and water." The revelation lands on Elijah like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. While he has remained safely hidden in foreign lands, this man has risked absolutely everything to preserve God's servants in the very heart of enemy territory. While the prophet had been sustained by miraculous provision, Obadiah had been sharing his own food with men who would have otherwise perished. Understanding dawned in Elijah's eyes. He could see the courage it had taken for this man to live a double life across 3 long years. He recognized the faith required to trust God in conditions far more dangerous than his own exile. His voice softened with both respect and gratitude. "As the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today. The promise carried the full weight of a divine oath. Elijah would not vanish again. He would not leave Obadiah alone to face royal fury. Today, the hiding was over, and the confrontation was about to begin. Obadiah gave a slow nod and turned toward Samaria, carrying news that would shake the kingdom to its very foundations. Behind him, Elijah prepared himself for the meeting that would determine the future of Israel. The stage had been set for the greatest spiritual battle in the nation's history. Fire from heaven, Mount Carmel rose above the surrounding hills like a green throne sitting in a brown kingdom. Even in the midst of drought, its slopes held more life than the dying plains, stretching out below. Springs hidden within rocky cliffs still offered water to those who knew where to search. Trees with deep roots continued to spread their leafy shade. This mountain would serve as the perfect stage for heaven's theater. The word spread through Israel like wildfire through dry grass. Elijah had returned. The prophet who had brought the drought was now calling for a gathering on Carmel. All of Israel was to come. The prophets of Baal and Asherah were required to attend. King Ahab himself would witness what happens when false gods are brought face to face with the true God of Israel. They came from every corner of the dying kingdom. Farmers left their withered fields behind. Merchants closed up their empty shops. Families packed what little they had and joined the streams of people flowing toward the sacred mountain. Some arrived, hoping for rain. Others came expecting spectacle. All of them came knowing they would witness something that would change everything. Ahab arrived with the grandeur expected of royalty, though his procession appeared shabby compared to what it had once been. Horses pulled his chariot, but their ribs pressed visibly through dull coats. Soldiers marched in formation, yet their uniforms hung loose on frames thinned by 3 years of poor rations. The crown still glittered on his head, but the man beneath it bore the marks of 3 years without rest. The prophets of Baal numbered 450 strong. They came dressed in their finest robes, carrying ceremonial knives and torches. Their confidence seemed unshakable. This was their moment to prove their God's power. 3 years of drought had only deepened their determination to call down fire and rain. The prophets of Asherah added another 400 to the false army. They brought carved poles and golden ornaments, instruments of worship polished to a mirror brightness. Their chants filled the air with exotic melodies that spoke of foreign lands and alien gods. Together, the false prophets outnumbered Elijah 850 to 1. But numbers mean nothing when heaven chooses to act. The lone prophet stood before the assembled multitude like David standing before Goliath. His clothes spoke of wilderness and wind. His hair moved wild and free. His eyes held depths that made proud men look away. When he spoke, his voice carried across the mountainside like thunder rolling ahead of a storm. How long will you waver between two opinions? The question cut through the crowd's murmur like a blade through silk. If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. The challenge could not have been clearer. No more compromise. No more hedging bets. Choose this day whom you will serve. The people remained as silent as stones. They wanted rain. They wanted prosperity. They wanted peace. But they did not want to choose between competing gods. Choice requires commitment. Commitment demands sacrifice. And sacrifice costs more than most people are willing to pay. Elijah continued with patient authority. I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. His words acknowledge the odds while completely dismissing their importance. God plus one always equals a majority when that one stands at the center of heaven's will. The terms of the contest sounded simple enough. 2 bulls would be prepared for sacrifice. 2 altars would be built. 2 groups of prophets would call on their gods to send fire down from heaven. The God who answered with flame would prove himself the true deity of Israel. You call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God. The crowd responded with approval. This made sense to minds that understood demonstrations better than doctrine. Let the gods compete. Let heaven reveal which religion deserved their allegiance. The prophets of Baal chose their bull and prepared their altar with elaborate ceremony. They arranged the wood with careful precision. They cut the meat into exact portions. They sprinkled sacred oils and muttered ritual blessings over everything. It all had to be perfect for their God to respond. Then began the strangest prayer meeting in all of human history. 450 prophets danced around their altar, calling on Baal with increasing desperation. Their voices rose in harmonized chanting that echoed off the mountain slopes. They leaped and shouted and waved their arms toward the cloudless sky. Morning passed into afternoon, and still no fire came down. The sun beat down mercilessly on the sweating prophets. Their voices grew hoarse from calling. Their feet stumbled from hours of dancing, but still they continued with the persistence of men whose lives depended entirely on their God's response. Elijah watched their efforts with something approaching pity. These were sincere men serving a false god. Their dedication deserved a kind of respect, even if their theology needed complete correction. But sincerity cannot substitute for truth. Dedication cannot overcome delusion. At noon, the prophet of Israel began to mock their efforts with gentle irony. Shout louder, surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy, or perhaps he has gone traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and needs to be awakened. His words stung because they gave voice to doubts already growing in every watching heart. The false prophets responded by increasing their frenzy. They shouted until their voices cracked. They danced until they collapsed from exhaustion. They cut themselves with knives and spears until blood flowed like the rain they were unable to produce. The mountain slope became a scene from a nightmare as hundreds of men wounded themselves in desperation. But the sky remained empty. No fire fell. No voice answered. No sign appeared to encourage their efforts. Baal remained as silent as the carved stone he truly was. The afternoon wore on, and their God offered nothing but the echo of their own voices. Finally, as evening drew near, their strength failed them completely. They stood around their altar like defeated soldiers after a lost battle. Blood stained their robes, dust covered their faces. Despair pressed their shoulders down like a heavy burden. Their God had failed them utterly. Now Elijah stepped forward to claim his turn. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something important was about to happen. The prophet worked alone, needing no assistance for what came next. He began by repairing the altar of the Lord that stood broken nearby. 12 stones represented the 12 tribes of Israel. Each stone spoke of covenant promises that had endured despite human faithlessness. Each piece told a story of God's faithfulness across generations of wandering. The altar rose slowly, built by steady hands that had learned to trust in heaven's timing. The wood was arranged, the bull was prepared, everything looked ready for a normal sacrifice. But then Elijah did something that made the crowd gasp in amazement. He called for 4 large jars to be filled with water and poured over the offering and the wood. Water, precious, irreplaceable water in a land that had known nothing but drought for 3 years. The people watched in shock as their most valuable resource soaked down into the wood and meat. 3 times the prophet commanded this shocking act. 12 jars of water disappeared into the altar until everything dripped with the liquid they had been craving for so long. The sacrifice became impossible by any natural means. Wet wood does not burn. Soaked meat does not ignite. The water pooled around the altar, in a trench dug for that exact purpose. If fire came now, it could only come from heaven. Then Elijah prayed. Not with dancing or shouting or cutting, not with elaborate ceremony or religious theater. He simply spoke to God, the way a man speaks to his closest friend. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me. So these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." The prayer lasted less than a minute. No repetition, no religious jargon, no manipulation. Just honest conversation between heaven and earth. The prophet asked for fire, not to prove his own power, but to demonstrate God's love for wayward Israel. Then it happened. Fire fell from heaven like lightning, yet controlled and purposeful. It consumed the bull, the wood, the stones, and even the dust surrounding the altar. It licked up the water in the trench as though it were oil. In seconds, nothing remained but empty ground where the altar had stood. The people fell on their faces as one. Terror and worship blended in their hearts like wine mixed with water. The cry rose from thousands of throats at once. "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." The declaration echoed off the mountain slopes and rolled across the kingdom like rolling thunder. Baal's prophets stood frozen in shock. Their God had been utterly defeated. Their theology lay in ruins. Their future stretched out dark and uncertain before them. Some began to run, but Elijah commanded that none be allowed to escape. Justice demanded payment for years of leading Israel astray. The false prophets died by the sword beside the Kishon River. Their blood watered the ground that had known no rain for 3 years. It seemed a harsh end, but the cancer of false religion requires radical surgery. Israel had to be healed, whatever the cost. As the sun sank behind Mount Carmel, the people began their journey home with hearts transformed by what they had witnessed. They had seen the futility of false gods. They had experienced the power of the true God. Most importantly, they had learned that heaven still cared deeply about the fate of wayward Israel. The fire had fallen. The prophets had been silenced. The choice had been made. Now only one thing remained. The rain had to come to seal heaven's victory and restore the land that drought had claimed. A cloud like a man's hand. The altar stones still smoldered. Smoke drifted across Mount Carmel as the last flames died away. The people had witnessed something beyond their understanding. Fire from heaven, God's answer to Elijah's simple prayer. Now the prophet turned his attention toward another miracle. 3 years without rain had left the land broken. Cracked earth stretched in every direction. Wells had run dry. Streams had become dust. Animals wandered in search of water that no longer existed. The drought Elijah had declared was complete, but God had spoken. The time for rain had come. Elijah climbed higher up the mountain. His servant followed close behind, footsteps echoing on the rocky path. They reached a place where they could look out across the Mediterranean. Blue waters stretched all the way to the horizon, calm and endless. Not a single cloud anywhere. "Go look toward the sea," Elijah told his servant. The young man shielded his eyes and gazed westward. Empty sky met empty water. Nothing stirred. "There is nothing," the servant reported. Elijah knelt on the ground. He bent low, face between his knees. The ancient posture of prayer, deep conversation with the Almighty. The prophet who had called down fire was now asking for rain. 7 times Elijah sent his servant to look. 7 times the answer came back exactly the same. Nothing. Clear skies, endless blue, no sign of change. The 7th time was different. The servant climbed back to his watching spot and scanned the horizon with care. Far out over the water, something small caught his eye, barely visible. A tiny wisp of white against the blue. "I see a small cloud," he called back, "like a man's hand." Elijah lifted his head. One small cloud. Nothing more than a whisper of moisture, but the prophet understood exactly what it meant. He jumped to his feet with sudden energy. "Go quickly to Ahab," Elijah commanded. "Tell him to get his chariot ready. Tell him to hurry down the mountain before the rain stops him." The servant ran toward the king's camp. Elijah watched that tiny cloud begin to grow. What had started as a wisp became a mass. What began small spread slowly across the whole sky. Wind began to stir. The air changed. Moisture gathered. Within minutes, the small cloud had become many clouds, rolling in from the sea, dark and heavy. Thunder rumbled in the distance, lightning flickered, the smell of rain filled the air. King Ahab needed no second warning. He had seen the fire fall. He knew this prophet spoke for God. His horses were quickly hitched to the royal chariot. The king climbed aboard, reins in hand. The first drops began to fall. Large, warm drops that struck the dry ground with tiny puffs of dust. Then more drops, faster, heavier. The drought was ending, but something strange then happened. As Ahab raced down the mountain road, a figure appeared beside his chariot, running, keeping pace with the horses. It was Elijah. The prophet ran alongside the royal chariot as rain began to pour. His robes were tucked into his belt for easier movement. Water streamed down his face. Lightning flashed overhead. Thunder crashed all around them. Ahab's horses were strong and fast. The chariot wheels spun across the muddy road, but Elijah matched their speed, step for step, mile after mile. The power of God strengthened the prophet's legs. They raced together through the gathering storm. Rain fell harder with each passing minute. What had been a drought became a deluge. Water rushed down hillsides. Dry creek beds filled and then overflowed. The land drank deeply after 3 years of thirst. Elijah ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. 18 miles of running in a thunderstorm. The prophet reached the city gates before the king's chariot. Impossible human effort, powered entirely by divine strength. The rain continued through the night, steady, soaking rain that worked its way deep into the soil. Farmers would wake to find their fields beginning to turn green again. Wells would fill. Springs would flow. The curse of drought had been lifted, from one small cloud to a mighty storm, from 3 years of dryness to abundant rain. God's timing was perfect, his provision complete. What he promised, he delivered. Elijah had learned to recognize God's signs. A tiny cloud meant a great downpour was coming. Small beginnings often lead to mighty endings. Faith sees the storm in a wisp of vapor. The prophet who had hidden by a brook now ran through the rain. The man who had waited in silence now witnessed God's power in motion. Every step he took through the storm was a declaration of trust. Rain washed the dust from Mount Carmel. It filled the streams of Gilead. It turned the wilderness green. 3 years of drought ended in one afternoon of storm. God's word through his prophet had been fulfilled completely. In Jezreel, Elijah finally stopped running, exhausted but victorious. The rain fell around him like a blessing. The long, dry season was over. New life was beginning. Jezebel's threat. Rain still drummed on the palace roof in Jezreel. King Ahab sat in his chambers, water still dripping from his clothes. The wild ride down from Mount Carmel had left him shaken. Fire from heaven, rain from a clear sky. This prophet clearly spoke for a God far more powerful than Baal. Ahab's wife found him there, staring at nothing. Queen Jezebel entered with her usual commanding presence. She noticed his troubled expression right away. "What happened on the mountain?" she demanded. Ahab began the story slowly. The challenge. The 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah, their frantic dancing and cutting, the silence from their gods. Then Elijah's simple prayer and the fire that consumed everything. All the prophets. Jezebel's voice grew cold. "Everyone," Ahab whispered. "The people killed them all by the brook. They said, 'The Lord is God.' They said it over and over again." Jezebel's face hardened. Her carefully built religious system had collapsed in a single afternoon. Years of work promoting Baal worship had been destroyed. Her imported prophets were dead. Her influence had been challenged by one wilderness prophet. She called for a messenger immediately. "Find this Elijah," she commanded. "Tell him that by this time tomorrow his life will be like the lives of my prophets. I swear it by my gods." The messenger rode through the storm to deliver the threat. He found Elijah still in Jezreel, resting after his miraculous run. The prophet listened as the queen's words were repeated. A death sentence, clear and simple. Jezebel had the power to carry out her threats. She commanded armies. She controlled the courts. She had killed prophets before without a moment's hesitation. Something unexpected happened to Elijah. Fear crept into his heart. Not the healthy respect he had shown in the face of God's power, but raw human terror. The same man who had stared down hundreds of false prophets now trembled at one woman's anger. Perhaps it was exhaustion, the long years of tension, the dramatic confrontation on the mountain, the supernatural run through the storm. His body and spirit were completely spent. When the threat came, he had no strength left to stand firm. Elijah rose and began walking, not toward Jezebel's palace to confront her, not toward safety among the people who had just declared the Lord as God. He walked away into the wilderness, away from everything. His servant followed, confused by this sudden flight. They walked through the night, the rain still falling. By morning they had covered many miles. The prophet who had outrun a chariot now fled like a common criminal. They reached Beersheba, far to the south in Judah. Here Elijah left his faithful servant behind. "Stay here," he said simply. No explanation, no plan for return. Just a man walking alone into emptiness. The wilderness stretched ahead, rocky hills and scattered thorns, a place where few people ever ventured, where silence ruled and solitude reigned. Elijah walked deeper into this desolation, carrying only his fears. He found a broom tree offering meager shade, not much shelter, but enough to stop his endless walking. The prophet collapsed beneath its thin branches, utterly spent. Everything felt wrong. The great victory on Carmel seemed meaningless now. Fire from heaven had not changed Jezebel's heart. Rain from God had not brought peace to the land. One threat had undone everything. "I have had enough, Lord," Elijah prayed. "Take my life. I am no better than my fathers." He had reached the end of himself. The bold prophet who had declared drought and called down fire now wanted only to die under a scraggly tree in an empty wilderness, far from anyone who might care. Elijah lay down in the shade and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly to his exhausted body. But his rest would not be empty. God was not finished with his prophet yet. The same Lord who had fed him by ravens and sustained him through drought would not abandon him in despair. Help was coming, though Elijah could not yet see it. Grace was near, though he felt only darkness. In the silence of the wilderness, mercy was preparing to speak. The whisper at Horeb. Sleep brought no peace to the exhausted prophet. Elijah lay beneath the broom tree, haunted by thoughts of Jezebel's anger. His body ached from the long flight south. His spirit felt crushed under the weight of failure and fear. Then something touched his shoulder, gentle but firm, a hand shaking him awake. "Get up and eat," a voice said. Elijah opened his eyes. An angel stood beside him, face kind but serious. Near his head sat fresh bread, still warm from baking. A jar of water waited nearby, cool and clean. The prophet sat up slowly. Everything hurt. His legs trembled from the long journey. His throat felt dry as dust, but the smell of the bread stirred his hunger. He ate quietly, grateful for the unexpected gift. When he finished, sleep took him again. Deep, dreamless rest beneath the desert sky. The angel waited patiently. A second time, the heavenly messenger touched his shoulder. "Get up and eat," came the same gentle command. "The journey is too great for you." More bread appeared. Fresh water filled the jar again. Elijah ate a second time, this time with growing strength. Food prepared by heaven tasted better than anything the earth could offer. Each bite restored more than just his body. The angel's words puzzled him. What journey? Elijah had fled to this wilderness to die, not to travel further. But as strength returned, understanding began to grow. God had plans that reached far beyond despair. Elijah rose and began walking again, not aimlessly this time, but with a purpose he could not yet name. His feet carried him south and east, through wadis and over ridges, past ancient paths worn smooth by countless travelers before him. 40 days he walked, 40 nights he traveled. The supernatural bread sustained him completely. No hunger weakened him. No thirst slowed his steps. Divine provision carried him through the empty places. His destination became clear as the landscape changed. Rocky peaks rose ahead, sacred ground where Moses had received the law. Mount Horeb, also called Sinai, the mountain of God. Elijah climbed the familiar paths. Here Moses had seen the burning bush. Here he had returned carrying tablets of stone. Here God had revealed his glory and spoken his name. If anywhere held answers for a troubled prophet, this was the place. He found a cave high on the mountainside, a hollow in the rock that offered shelter and solitude. Here he could wait. Here he could listen. Here, perhaps, God would explain why everything had gone wrong. As night fell, the word of the Lord came to him, not in a grand vision or a mighty voice, but as a simple question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The prophet's answer poured out like a flood. All his frustration and confusion, all his sense of failure and fear. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty," he began. "The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." Everything he had worked for seemed lost. The people had witnessed miracles and still followed other gods. The victory on Carmel had lasted only a day. He felt completely alone in his faithfulness. "Go out and stand on the mountain," God commanded. "I am about to pass by." Elijah stepped from the cave onto a rocky ledge. The night was calm and still. Stars shone clearly in the desert sky. Peace surrounded the mountain. Then the earth began to shake. Violent trembling that split rocks and sent stones tumbling down the slopes. A great and powerful wind followed, bending trees and howling through the canyons. After the wind came fire, lighting the darkness with fierce intensity. But in none of these mighty displays was the Lord present. When the earthquake stopped, when the wind died down, when the fire faded, silence returned. Deep, complete quiet that seemed to hold its own breath. And in that silence came a gentle whisper, quiet as breathing, soft as a sigh. A still, small voice that spoke more clearly than any storm. Elijah knew this was God. Not in the dramatic signs he had expected, but in the whisper that reached his heart. He pulled his cloak over his face and stepped to the mouth of the cave. The same question came again. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The prophet gave the same answer. His complaints remained unchanged. His sense of isolation persisted. But something was different now. The whisper had touched places no earthquake could reach. God's response brought perspective to his despair. Elijah was not alone. 7,000 in Israel had never bowed to Baal, hidden faithful ones he had never seen, quiet believers who still honored the true God. His work was not finished either. 3 tasks awaited him: kings to anoint, a successor to train, justice to set in motion. God's plans would continue, with or without Elijah's complete understanding. The whisper taught what no storm could teach. God's greatest power often moves in silence. His mightiest works happen without fanfare. The still, small voice accomplishes more than any earthquake. Elijah left the cave a changed man, not changed by spectacle but by whisper, not by answers but by presence. Sometimes the softest voice carries the strongest message. Elisha the farmer. Morning light touched the fields near Abel Meholah. 12 teams of oxen moved in formation across the fertile ground, each pair guided by a different man. The spring plowing had begun in earnest, preparing the soil for another year's harvest. Elisha worked with the last team, his hands firm on the wooden plow. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the oxen strained against the heavy earth. This was good land, rich and dark. His family had farmed here for generations. The young man knew these fields the way he knew his own face. Every slope and hollow, where water gathered after rain, which sections yielded the best grain. Farming was in his blood, passed down from father to son like a sacred trust. His father, Shaphat, owned considerable property. 12 teams of oxen meant real wealth in this agricultural society. Each team represented years of careful breeding and patient training. The family had prospered through hard work and wise planning. Elisha had grown up with dirt under his fingernails and calluses on his palms. He understood the rhythm of seasons, when to plant, when to harvest, how to read weather signs and soil conditions. The land spoke to him in a language learned from childhood. But on this particular morning, something would change everything. A figure appeared at the edge of the field, walking steadily toward the plowing teams. The workers noticed him first, pointing and whispering among themselves. Strangers were uncommon in this rural area. As the man drew closer, Elisha recognized him. Everyone in Israel knew this face. The wild hair and rough clothing marked him clearly. This was Elijah the Tishbite, the prophet who had called down fire from heaven. Elijah walked directly toward Elisha's team. His eyes held purpose and certainty. He carried something in his hand, a cloak worn from years of travel, the prophet's mantle, symbol of his calling and his authority. Without a word, Elijah threw his cloak around Elisha's shoulders. The rough fabric settled over the young farmer like a new identity, heavy with meaning, weighted with destiny. Then, just as silently, Elijah turned and walked away. No explanation, no detailed instructions, just the cloak and the clear understanding of what it meant, a call to prophetic ministry, an invitation to leave everything behind. Elisha stood frozen for a moment. The oxen waited patiently, sensing their master's distraction. Around him, the other workers had stopped their plowing to stare. The moment felt suspended in time. The young farmer looked at his oxen, then at his fields, then at the retreating figure of Elijah. His old life and his new calling pulled in opposite directions. The choice was his to make. "Wait," Elisha called after the prophet. He began running, the cloak flowing behind him. When he caught up with Elijah, his request was simple and reasonable. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I will come with you." Elijah's response seemed almost harsh at first. "Go back, what have I done to you?" But his tone suggested testing rather than rejection. He wanted to see the depth of Elisha's commitment. Elisha understood that this was not about permission, but about priority. The call to prophetic ministry demanded total dedication. Half-hearted followers would not survive the challenges that lay ahead. The young man returned to his team, but not to resume plowing. Instead, he began unhitching the oxen. His fellow workers watched in amazement as he prepared for something dramatic. Elisha took the wooden plow and yoke and broke them into pieces. Seasoned wood that had served faithfully for years became kindling for a great fire. He slaughtered his team of oxen, using the wooden farming tools as fuel to cook the meat. The aroma drew people from surrounding fields and nearby houses. Word spread quickly that Shaphat's son was holding some kind of feast. Neighbors gathered, curious about this sudden celebration. Elisha distributed the roasted meat freely. Everyone ate their fill. It was more than a meal. It was a declaration. The young farmer was burning his bridges, making a return to his old life completely impossible. When the feast ended and the fire burned low, Elisha walked away from everything he had ever known. The fields where he had worked, the family business he might have inherited, the comfortable and predictable life of a successful farmer. He followed Elijah into uncertainty. No guarantee of where they would sleep or what they would eat. No promise of safety or success. Just the call of God and the mentor who would teach him to hear the divine voice. Behind them, the ashes of Elisha's former life cooled slowly in the evening air. Ahead lay adventures and trials he could not begin to imagine. The farmer had become a prophet's apprentice. The cloak that Elijah had thrown now belonged to Elisha completely. Not just the physical garment, but everything it represented. Authority, responsibility, a life spent listening for God's whisper and speaking his words to a world that rarely wanted to hear them. From that day forward, Elisha served Elijah faithfully, learning, watching, preparing for the time when the master's cloak would pass to him permanently. Naboth's vineyard. King Ahab strolled through his palace gardens in Samaria. Fruit trees heavy with ripening harvest lined the pathways. Carefully tended flower beds displayed their colors in neat rows. But the king's attention kept drifting toward something beyond his walls. Just next to the royal property grew a small vineyard, ancient vines, well established and productive. The location was perfect, close enough to become part of the palace grounds. Ahab had admired it many times during his walks. The vineyard belonged to a man named Naboth, a Jezreelite who had inherited the land from his ancestors. His family had tended these vines for generations. Each plant was like a child to him, nurtured with care and knowledge passed down through the years. Ahab decided to make an offer. He approached Naboth with what seemed like reasonable terms. "Give me your vineyard," the king proposed. "I want to use it for a vegetable garden since it is so close to my palace. In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard elsewhere, or if you prefer, I will pay you whatever it is worth in money." The offer was generous by most standards. Fair market value, or even better land in trade. Many men would have jumped at the chance to make such a deal with the king himself. But Naboth's answer came quickly and firmly. "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." This was not about money or even better land. This vineyard represented something sacred, family heritage, generational blessing, the covenant relationship between God's people and the land he had given them. According to the law of Moses, family property was to remain within the clan. It could not be sold permanently to outsiders. Even if economic hardship forced a temporary sale, the land would return to the original family during the year of Jubilee. Naboth was not being stubborn or greedy. He was being faithful to God's commands and his family's trust. The vineyard was not his to give away, even to a king. Ahab returned to his palace, angry and sullen. He had been refused, and his royal pride had been wounded. The king, who could command armies and build cities, could not obtain one small vineyard from a common citizen. He threw himself on his bed and turned his face to the wall. Like a spoiled child denied a toy, Ahab refused to eat. His servants offered food, and he waved them away. The mighty ruler of Israel pouted over grapes. Queen Jezebel found him in this pathetic state. "Why are you so sullen? Why won't you eat?" Ahab explained his failed negotiation with Naboth. The vineyard so close to the palace, the seemingly reasonable offer, the stubborn refusal, based on some old religious law. Jezebel listened with growing impatience. Her husband's weakness disgusted her. In her homeland of Sidon, kings took what they wanted without asking permission from peasants. "Is this how you act as king over Israel?" she demanded. "Get up and eat. Cheer up. I will get you the vineyard of Naboth, the Jezreelite." While Ahab continued his sulking, Jezebel began planning. She wrote letters in the king's name and sealed them with his official seal. Her scheme was simple but deadly. The letters went to the elders and nobles in Naboth's city, with instructions for a public assembly, a fast day to seek God's guidance on some urgent matter. Naboth was to be given a seat of honor among the people. 2 worthless men were hired as false witnesses. They would publicly accuse Naboth of cursing both God and the king. Blasphemy and treason wrapped in one charge, crimes punishable by death under Jewish law. The plan worked perfectly. The assembly gathered. Naboth took his honored seat, completely unaware of the trap closing around him. At the appointed time, the false witnesses stood and made their accusations. "Naboth has cursed both God and the king," they declared. The crowd responded with shock and anger. Cursing God was the ultimate sacrilege. Cursing the king was treason. Both crimes deserved the harshest punishment. They dragged Naboth outside the city and stoned him to death. No trial, no defense allowed. Just mob justice built entirely on lies. The innocent man died protecting his family's inheritance. News of Naboth's death reached Jezebel quickly. She went immediately to her husband with victory in her voice. "Get up and take possession of the vineyard of Naboth, the Jezreelite, that he refused to sell you. He is no longer alive, but dead." Ahab arose from his bed with sudden energy. His appetite returned. The sullen mood lifted. He dressed and walked directly toward his prize. But as the king entered Naboth's vineyard, another figure appeared among the vines. Tall and imposing, hair wild from the wilderness. The prophet Elijah stepped from the shadows like an avenging angel. "Have you found me, my enemy?" Ahab asked nervously. "I have found you," Elijah replied, "because you have sold yourself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord." God's judgment fell like a hammer blow. Ahab's dynasty would be destroyed. Dogs would lick his blood in the very same place where Naboth had died. Jezebel would meet an even worse fate, her body devoured by dogs outside Jezreel's walls. The vineyard Ahab had coveted would become a monument to divine justice. The grapes he had desired would be watered with tears of judgment. What had seemed like royal victory had become the beginning of royal doom. Naboth had died for his faithfulness, but his blood cried out from the ground for justice. And God, who sees every sparrow fall, had heard that cry. Chariots of Samaria. 3 years passed in relative quiet. No direct confrontation between Ahab and the prophet who had pronounced his doom. The king may have hoped that Elijah's words would fade with time, that divine judgment could somehow be avoided through delay. But God's timing is not man's timing. Justice delayed is not justice denied. War clouds gathered on Israel's borders. Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, had recovered from his earlier defeats. His armies were strong again and ready to reclaim territory lost in previous battles. The target was clear. Ramoth-Gilead, a strategic city east of the Jordan River. King Jehoshaphat of Judah came north to visit his ally. The two kingdoms had maintained peace through careful diplomacy and royal marriages. Now Ahab saw an opportunity to strengthen their bond through shared military action. "Will you go with me to fight against Ramoth-Gilead?" Ahab asked his southern counterpart. Jehoshaphat's response was encouraging. "I am as you are. My people as your people, my horses as your horses." The alliance would hold. Two kingdoms would march together against their common enemy. But Jehoshaphat was a godly king who sought divine guidance before making major decisions. "First, seek the counsel of the Lord," he requested. Ahab gathered his prophets. 400 men who claimed to speak for God, but served the royal court far more than they served heaven. Their message was unanimous and enthusiastic. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and be victorious," they declared. "The Lord will give it into the king's hand." Something about their unified optimism troubled Jehoshaphat. True prophets often disagreed with each other and pushed back against royal plans. These men seemed far too eager to please. "Is there not a prophet of the Lord here whom we can inquire of?" he asked. Ahab's face darkened. "There is still one man through whom we can inquire of the Lord, but I hate him because he never prophesies anything good about me, but always bad. He is Micaiah, son of Imlah." Reluctantly, Ahab sent for this unwelcome prophet. While they waited, the 400 court prophets continued their performance. One even fashioned iron horns as visual aids, pushing and goring the air to demonstrate how Israel would defeat Syria. Micaiah arrived under guard, clearly no friend of the royal court. The messenger who had brought him offered some friendly advice. "Look, the other prophets are all predicting success for the king. Let your word agree with theirs, and speak favorably." But Micaiah's response revealed his integrity. "As surely as the Lord lives, I can tell him only what the Lord tells me." When brought before the two kings, Micaiah initially appeared to agree with the court prophets, but his sarcastic tone made his true meaning clear. Pressed to speak honestly, he delivered God's real message. "I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd." And the Lord said, These people have no master. Let each one go home in peace." The true prophet saw disaster ahead. Ahab would not return from this battle. His army would be defeated and scattered. The shepherd king would fall, leaving his flock defenseless. Ahab's anger flared. "Didn't I tell you that he never prophesies anything good about me, but only bad?" Micaiah continued with even more disturbing revelations. He had seen a vision of God's throne room, where a lying spirit had been commissioned to deceive Ahab's prophets. The false encouragement the king had received was part of divine judgment. "Put this fellow in prison," Ahab commanded. "Give him nothing but bread and water until I return safely." Micaiah's parting words carried the full weight of prophecy. "If you ever return safely, the Lord has not spoken through me." Despite the warning, both kings prepared for war. Their armies marched east toward Ramoth-Gilead. Chariots and cavalry, infantry with spears and shields, a formidable force that should have been more than capable of capturing one contested city. But Ahab took precautions. Perhaps Micaiah's words had shaken his confidence more than he wanted to admit. The king decided to disguise himself for battle, removing royal insignia and wearing ordinary armor. Jehoshaphat would remain in his royal robes, clearly identifiable as a king. The battle joined fiercely around the walls of Ramoth-Gilead. Syrian and Israelite forces clashed with sword and spear. Chariots wheeled and charged. Arrows filled the air like deadly rain. The Syrian king had given specific orders to his chariot commanders. "Do not fight with anyone, small or great, except the king of Israel." Ahab was the primary target. Kill him, and the battle would be won. When Syrian chariots spotted Jehoshaphat in his royal robes, they assumed this was their quarry. They surrounded him completely, spears ready to deliver the final blow. But when Jehoshaphat cried out, they realized their mistake. This was the wrong king. Meanwhile, Ahab's disguise seemed to be working. Hidden among common soldiers, he appeared safe from any targeted attack. The strategy might have succeeded, except for one arrow fired by one Syrian archer. The bowman was not aiming at anyone in particular. He simply drew his bow and released it into the mass of fighting men. Random warfare, without a specific target. But God guides even arrows shot at random. The shaft found a gap in Ahab's armor, between the sections of his breastplate, where the joints allowed movement, but created a point of vulnerability. The tip drove deep, finding flesh beneath the bronze and leather. Ahab knew immediately that the wound was mortal. Blood flowed freely, pooling on the floor of his chariot, but the battle still raged around him, and retreat would cause panic among his troops. "Take me out of the battle," he told his chariot driver. "I am wounded." They moved toward the rear of the fighting. But the king could not leave entirely. His presence was still needed to hold morale together. So Ahab propped himself upright in his chariot, blood steadily draining from his body, watching his army fight on. All day the battle continued. All day Ahab grew weaker. As evening approached, the king of Israel died. The shepherd had fallen, just as Micaiah had prophesied. Word spread quickly through the ranks. Every man to his town, every man to his country. The army scattered like sheep without a shepherd. They brought Ahab's body back to Samaria for burial, royal honors for a king who had sold his soul for a vineyard. When they washed his chariot at the pool of Samaria, dogs came to lick the blood, the same place where Naboth's blood had once cried out for justice. Elijah's prophecy had been fulfilled to the letter. Divine justice had found its mark as surely as that one random arrow. Ahaziah's fall. The palace in Samaria felt empty without King Ahab's commanding presence. His son, Ahaziah, now sat on Israel's throne, but the crown weighed heavily on young shoulders. The new king lacked his father's political instincts and military experience. Ahaziah had inherited more than just royal authority. He had also inherited his parents' devotion to foreign gods. Baal worship continued under his reign, encouraged by Queen Mother Jezebel, who still wielded considerable influence within the court. The kingdom faced immediate challenges from the outside as well. Moab, long held as a tribute-paying vassal, sensed weakness in the transition of power and rebelled against Israelite control, cutting off a significant source of royal income. Other neighbors watched carefully for further signs of instability. But domestic troubles would prove more dangerous than any foreign enemy. The upper chambers of the royal palace in Samaria had been built for comfort and privacy. Large windows allowed cooling breezes during the hot summer months. Decorative latticework provided beauty while maintaining airflow through the rooms. Ahaziah was walking through his upper chamber one day when disaster struck without warning. Perhaps he leaned too heavily against a window. Maybe the latticework had weakened over time. Whatever the cause, the decorative barrier gave way. The king fell through the broken lattice to the stone floor below. The impact was severe, crushing bones and causing internal injuries. Servants rushed to help, but the damage was clearly serious. Ahaziah's life hung in the balance. As he lay in pain, unable to move without agony, the young king's thoughts turned to spiritual matters. Who could heal such injuries? Which God held power over life and death? Rather than seeking the Lord God of Israel, Ahaziah chose to follow his family's religious preferences. He would consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron. This Philistine deity was well known for giving oracles about health and recovery. "Go and consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron," Ahaziah told his messengers. "Ask whether I will recover from this injury." The mission seemed straightforward enough. Travel to the Philistine city of Ekron. Present the king's question to the priests of Baal-zebub. Return with whatever answer the god provided. Royal messengers had carried out similar diplomatic and religious errands many times before, but this particular journey would not proceed as planned. The messengers set out from Samaria, traveling southwest toward Philistine territory. The road was well-traveled, used regularly by merchants and diplomats conducting business between the nations. They expected no difficulties reaching their destination. However, as they walked along the highway, a figure appeared ahead of them, tall and imposing, with wild hair and rough clothing, the unmistakable appearance of a wilderness prophet. This was Elijah the Tishbite. The prophet stepped directly into their path, blocking any further progress toward Ekron. His presence commanded immediate attention. Even royal messengers knew better than to ignore this man. "Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going off to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron?" Elijah demanded. The question struck at the very heart of Israel's spiritual crisis. The nation that had witnessed fire from heaven was now sending messengers to consult foreign gods. The people who had seen rain return after 3 years of drought were now seeking answers from Philistine idols. Elijah's message for King Ahaziah was direct and final. "This is what the Lord says. You will not leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die." The messengers stood frozen. They had received a divine oracle, but not from the source they had intended to consult. Should they continue to Ekron? Should they return immediately to the king? The prophet's authority was undeniable. Without another word, Elijah turned and walked away. The messengers watched him disappear into the distance, then looked uncertainly at each other. Their mission had been interrupted by God himself. They decided to return to Samaria immediately. The journey back felt longer than the trip out. How would they explain this encounter to their injured king? How would Ahaziah receive such unwelcome news? When they appeared before the king's bed far sooner than expected, Ahaziah was surprised. "Why have you come back so soon?" The messengers reported their strange encounter faithfully. A man had stopped them on the road. He claimed to speak for the Lord God of Israel. His message was clear and ominous. The king would not recover from his injuries. "What kind of man was it who came to meet you and told you this?" Ahaziah asked. Their description was precise. He had a garment of hair and wore a leather belt around his waist. Recognition dawned immediately. Ahaziah knew exactly who had intercepted his messengers. That was Elijah the Tishbite. The same prophet who had troubled his father throughout his entire reign, the man who had called down fire from heaven and brought rain after 3 years of drought. The voice of judgment, who had pronounced doom on the entire house of Ahab. Fear and anger warred in the young king's heart. Part of him trembled at Elijah's words, knowing the prophet's long track record for accuracy. But royal pride demanded action. No wilderness preacher would dictate terms to the king of Israel. Ahaziah decided on a show of force. If Elijah wanted to challenge royal authority, he would face the full consequences. The king summoned his military commanders and gave them a direct order. "Send a captain along with 50 soldiers to bring this prophet in," he commanded. "Bring Elijah here to answer for his meddling." The company departed Samaria with full confidence. 50 armed and trained soldiers seemed more than sufficient to seize one wandering desert prophet. Their captain was a seasoned officer who had handled many difficult operations. This mission felt like routine work. They located Elijah sitting calmly on top of a hill, completely undisturbed by their arrival. The prophet displayed no sign of alarm as the troops closed in and surrounded his position. He observed their careful formation with the quiet patience of someone who already knew how things would unfold. The captain made his way partway up the hill and shouted his command. "Man of God," the king says, "come down." Elijah's reply was brief and absolute. "If I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Fire descended at once. Not a slow building heat that allowed any chance of escape, but a sudden and total blaze that swallowed all 51 soldiers in a single devastating moment. The hillside where they had stood was left scorched and blackened. Silence settled back over the wilderness. News of the catastrophe reached King Ahaziah without delay. 50 experienced fighting men wiped out in an instant. The prophet remained free and completely untouched. Royal power had been challenged and had come up short, yet Ahaziah's fury only grew stronger. Perhaps the first captain had approached with too much arrogance. Maybe a different manner would bring a different outcome. The king dispatched another 50 men under a new commander. This second captain attempted a more measured and respectful tone. "Man of God, this is what the king says. Come down at once." Elijah's answer did not change. "If I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Fire fell from heaven once more. Once more, 51 soldiers died in that instant. Fresh scorch marks scarred the hillside as testimony to divine authority. 2 full companies of Israel's army had now been destroyed by the very prophet they had been sent to capture. Back in Samaria, the king absorbed the news of the second loss with deepening desperation. 102 men dead. His military strength was visibly shrinking, and his authority was being openly defied by forces no earthly power could oppose. Still, Ahaziah refused to back down. Pride would not permit him to concede. A third captain was handed orders to seize Elijah, despite the unmistakable danger the assignment carried. But this third commander proved wiser than the 2 who had gone before him. When he reached the hill where Elijah sat waiting, he chose humility over arrogance. Climbing toward the prophet, he dropped to his knees. "Man of God," he pleaded, "please have respect for my life and the lives of these 50 men, your servants. See, fire has fallen from heaven and consumed the first 2 captains and all their men. But now have respect for my life." His words acknowledged Elijah's authority and the power he wielded. No commands, no royal threats, nothing but a humble appeal for mercy from a man who clearly understood he stood before someone who spoke for the Almighty. The angel of the Lord spoke privately to Elijah. "Go down with him, do not be afraid of him." For the first time, the prophet descended from the hill. He walked quietly alongside the soldiers, no longer their quarry but their companion. They had come as a capture party and were now transformed into an honor escort. When the group arrived at the palace, Elijah was brought directly to King Ahaziah's bedside. The wounded monarch lay propped against pillows, pale from blood loss and weakened by his injuries. Standing face to face with the king, the prophet delivered the identical message that his earlier messengers had carried. But now those words arrived with far greater weight, spoken directly by the man who had twice called fire from the sky in a single day. This is what the Lord says. Is it because there is no God in Israel for you to consult that you have sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Because you have done this, you will never leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die. The prophecy was fulfilled precisely as spoken. King Ahaziah never rose from his injuries sustained in the fall through the lattice. He died in that bed, having reigned over Israel for only 2 years. Because Ahaziah left no sons, his brother Joram stepped onto the throne after him. The house of Ahab continued, but it lived beneath the shadow of divine judgment that would eventually consume the entire dynasty. The God of Israel had demonstrated once again that he alone held authority over life and death. Foreign gods offered no genuine help in moments of true crisis. Only the Lord could heal, and only the Lord determined whether healing would come. Fire from heaven. King Ahaziah died exactly as Elijah had declared he would. His brother Joram inherited the throne of Israel, along with all the unresolved tensions surrounding that troublesome prophet from Gilead. The new king had watched his brother's fate unfold and understood the kind of power Elijah possessed. But political pressure pushed him toward action regardless. The royal court hummed with whispered conversations about the prophet's continued freedom. Military commanders grumbled that their authority had been made to look hollow. How could a kingdom maintain order if a wilderness preacher could strike down soldiers without facing any consequences? Some advisors counseled restraint. They had seen what happened to the previous king's messengers. Fire from heaven was not something any earthly fighting force could overcome. Perhaps the wiser course was to leave Elijah alone. Others pressed for stronger action. The prophet's repeated interference in royal affairs could not be allowed to stand. If one man could defy the crown without punishment, others would be emboldened to follow. The very foundation of royal authority was at risk. Joram found himself pulled in opposite directions. Part of him genuinely feared the prophet's power, while another part felt the obligation to assert his royal standing. His decision about how to handle Elijah would shape the character of his early reign. The new king chose to test the prophet's resolve one more time. Perhaps Ahaziah's death had already satisfied divine justice. Maybe enough had shifted that a different outcome was possible. A new military expedition was ordered, though this time with a different strategy. Rather than a single company, a larger force would go out. Rather than issuing demands for surrender, they would attempt an actual physical capture. Superior numbers might accomplish what smaller groups had failed to do. A captain of 50 received his orders with noticeable reluctance. He had heard every story about those burned hillsides and vanished soldiers. No sensible officer would choose this assignment willingly, but royal commands allowed no room for refusal. The company marched out of Samaria, carrying heavy hearts, 50 capable men walking toward what might well be their own destruction. They moved slowly, each mile drawing them closer to a confrontation none of them wanted. They found Elijah in his familiar place, seated calmly on a hillside with a clear view of the surrounding land. The prophet looked completely at ease, as though he had already known they were coming. No anxiety showed in his weathered face. The captain approached with official formality but little eagerness. His words carried the weight of royal authority, while his tone betrayed personal reluctance. "Man of God," he called out. "The king says, come down." The same demand that had cost 2 previous captains everything. The same challenge to divine authority that had produced fire from the sky on both occasions. But perhaps this time, things would go differently. Elijah's response came back unchanged. No variation in the wording. No shift in tone. Divine consistency confronting repeated human stubbornness. "If I am a man of God," the prophet declared, "may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Fire fell immediately, intense and complete, leaving no window for escape or final words. The third company of soldiers vanished in flames, just as their predecessors had. The hillside bore fresh marks of scorching as further evidence of God's undiminished power. King Joram received word at his palace with mounting desperation. 3 companies destroyed, 153 soldiers dead. The kingdom's fighting strength was being steadily worn away by the prayers of one man. But the young king was not prepared to accept defeat. Royal pride and political necessity demanded that he continue. Perhaps a completely different approach would finally produce results. Maybe overwhelming numbers could somehow outlast even divine intervention. Orders were sent out for a 4th expedition. This time an entire company would go, but under different instructions. Rather than demanding immediate compliance, they would attempt to surround and take the prophet through tactical superiority. The new captain was selected for his reputation and extensive experience. If anyone stood a chance where all the others had failed, this man was the one. He studied the previous failures carefully, searching for any lesson that might prevent another disaster. When his men were assembled and fully equipped, the captain spoke honestly to them about the dangers of their mission. Every man present knew what had befallen the earlier expeditions. This assignment could cost them their lives. But military discipline held firm. Orders required obedience, regardless of personal fear. The soldiers would carry out their duty, even if that duty led them to destruction. They marched out of Samaria with grim resolve. Once again, they found Elijah on his hill, serene and untroubled by their approach. The prophet appeared almost unhurried about these repeated encounters. How many times would earthly kings press against heavenly power before learning what could not be overcome? But as the 4th captain climbed toward Elijah's position, something shifted. Instead of shouting commands from a safe distance, he came close enough to speak quietly. Instead of standing tall with authority, he fell to his knees. "Man of God," he said with genuine humility, "please have respect for my life and the lives of these 50 men, your servants." This was not the voice of royal authority issuing demands. This was a frightened man asking for mercy from someone he recognized as far greater than himself. The captain pressed on with visible sincerity. "See, fire has fallen from heaven and consumed the first 2 captains and all their men, but now have respect for my life." The shift was striking. Acknowledgement of Elijah's power, recognition of the previous disasters, and a humble request for grace where arrogant demands had always been offered before. Something changed in the spiritual atmosphere. The angel of the Lord spoke new instructions to Elijah. This captain's humility had opened something that arrogance had always kept shut. "Go down with him," the angel directed. "Do not be afraid of him." For the first time since this entire confrontation had begun, Elijah rose from his position on the hill. He walked peacefully down toward the waiting soldiers, no longer their target, but their guide. The soldiers arranged themselves around him in a respectful formation. They were no longer attempting a capture, but providing an escort. One man's willingness to bow before divine authority had transformed enemies into protectors. The procession moved toward Samaria at a measured and unhurried pace. No urgency drove them. The crisis had passed the moment one man chose humility over pride. When they arrived at the palace, Elijah stood directly before King Joram. The young king waited with poorly concealed nerves, unsure what to expect from this legendary figure who had brought so much trouble to his entire family. Elijah's message was pointed and clear. The same truth he had delivered to the previous king, now spoken before a living audience who still had time to choose a different path. "This is what the Lord says," Elijah declared. "Is it because there is no God in Israel for you to consult that you have sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron?" The question cut to the heart of royal policy. Why reach toward foreign gods when the true God of Israel remained available? Why place trust in Philistine idols when the Creator of heaven and earth offered his counsel directly? But this time no immediate pronouncement of death followed. Joram still had the opportunity to choose differently. The fire from heaven had served as warning, not as a closing verdict. Whether the young king would draw any wisdom from his brother's end remained entirely up to him. The prophet had spoken what he had been sent to say. What came next belonged to the earthly rulers who would face the weight of their own decisions. Elijah left the palace as quietly as he had entered it. The soldiers who had marched out to arrest him now formed a respectful guard for his departure. Humility had achieved what force never could. The final journey begins. Years had come and gone since those dramatic encounters with fire from heaven. Elijah had grown older now. His hair had turned whiter. His step perhaps carried a little less spring than before, but his spiritual clarity had not dimmed at all, and he understood that his remaining time on earth was running short. Walking beside him was Elisha, no longer the young farmer who had burned his plows the day a prophet threw a cloak over his shoulders. Seasons of shared experience had shaped him into a seasoned man of God, prepared to carry the prophetic calling forward. The student had become a successor. Their bond had deepened through trials endured together and quiet hours spent side by side. Elisha had watched his master summon fire, restore the dead, and speak truth without flinching into the faces of kings. He had absorbed not only the dramatic outward acts of prophecy, but the quiet, daily discipline of listening for God's voice in ordinary silence. On this particular morning, both men sensed something different, settled over the day. A finality that had never been present before. Something written in the air itself, like a divine appointment. This day would not be like any they had shared before. "Stay here," Elijah told his companion as they prepared to leave Gilgal. "The Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha had no intention of being left behind. Not today, when everything felt charged with eternal meaning. He had followed his master far too long to step away now. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live," Elisha replied, "I will not leave you." The oath was firm and without condition. No circumstance would separate them on this final walk. Whatever waited ahead, they would meet it together. They traveled from Gilgal toward Bethel, the ancient city where Jacob had once dreamed of angels moving up and down a ladder reaching into heaven. Sacred ground where God had confirmed his covenant promises to the patriarch, a fitting place to pass through on a prophetic pilgrimage such as this. As they neared Bethel, a group of prophets came out to receive them. These were not the court prophets who bent their words to please kings, but genuine men of God who had recognized what this particular day meant. One of them drew Elisha aside and spoke in a low voice. "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" Their words confirmed what Elisha already felt stirring in his chest. This was Elijah's final day on earth. The great prophet would soon be removed from Israel, leaving behind a vacancy that seemed impossible to imagine filling. "Yes, I know," Elisha replied quietly. "So be quiet." He had no desire to spend these final hours in discussion about the approaching separation. Some truths were too sacred for open conversation. Better to remain close in companionship than to pass the time in endless speculation about what God had already decided. When the exchange with the prophets had ended, Elijah tried once more to send his companion away. "Stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho." Elisha held firm. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." They walked on together toward Jericho, the ancient city sitting near the Jordan River, the place where Joshua had once led all of Israel into the promised land, where walls had collapsed at the sound of trumpets. Another location, dense with the memory of what God could do when people trusted him. At Jericho, the scene repeated itself with quiet precision. Prophets approached Elisha with the same whispered question, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" Again, Elisha confirmed his knowledge and again asked for silence. He understood what was coming. No amount of talking would alter it. Better to hold these final moments carefully than to dissolve them in unnecessary speech. One more time, Elijah attempted to leave his student. "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And one more time, Elisha refused. "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." The pattern revealed both men with perfect clarity. Elijah, thoughtful and considerate even now, trying to spare his companion the anguish of watching their final separation. Elisha, loyal past the point of reason, unwilling to abandon his master at the very moment it mattered most. 50 prophets from Jericho followed at a respectful distance behind them. They sensed the historic weight pressing down on this moment. Something that had never happened before was about to occur. They took up a position from which they could witness whatever was coming. The small group moved steadily toward the Jordan River, those same waters that had parted for Joshua in a generation long past, the boundary between wilderness wandering and promised possession. Here, the final act of Elijah's earthly ministry would be performed. Both master and student understood that everything they had shared was drawing to its close. The teacher who had once called fire from the sky would soon ascend into that same sky himself. The student who had left his plough behind to follow would soon find himself standing alone. But the purposes of God were larger than human grief. The prophetic calling would continue. Divine plans would reach their completion. What looked from earth like an ending was, in the wider view, a beginning. As they came to the Jordan's edge, the river moved steady and full before them. No supernatural opening had appeared yet. The water remained as it always was, a wide obstacle to anyone on foot. But Elijah wore the cloak that had once called Elisha away from his farming. The same mantle that had covered a young farmer now rested on shoulders that had borne the weight of Israel's spiritual condition for long decades. The final miracle of Elijah's earthly ministry was about to begin. The Jordan would open one more time, but this crossing would be unlike every previous one. Only one man would return. Crossing the Jordan. The Jordan River moved before them, its water running brown and swift with the force of recent upstream rains. Spring currents carried along broken branches and river mud, all of it rolling steadily toward the Dead Sea. 2 men on foot had no way through it by ordinary means. Elijah stood at the bank and pulled off his cloak, the rough, woolen garment that had sheltered him across years of wilderness travel, the mantle that had marked him as God's appointed servant. Fabric worn soft and thin by weather and long use, yet still carrying all the authority heaven had placed in it. He rolled the cloak tight and raised it above his head. Then, with the same unhesitating confidence he had demonstrated before kings and false prophets alike, Elijah brought the cloak down hard against the surface of the water. The Jordan responded at once. Waters that had been flowing south divided and stacked themselves on either side, leaving a clear path of exposed riverbed between. Mud and scattered stones and stranded fish marked the river's sudden retreat. Elijah stepped down onto the uncovered ground, without a moment's pause. His feet found firm footing where rushing water had made crossing impossible just a breath before. Elisha followed immediately behind him, wonder visible in his expression. The 50 prophets watching from Jericho drew sharp breaths. They had grown up hearing the accounts of Moses parting the Red Sea, and Joshua crossing this same river with all of Israel behind him. To watch that same divine power working through one man's simple act of faith was something else entirely. Master and student crossed side by side on dry ground. The walls of water held steady on both sides of the path. Fish moved through vertical columns of suspended river. Below their sandals, smooth stones pressed up from the riverbed floor. They walked between 2 worlds, suspended in a space where the natural and supernatural had joined together without friction. When they stepped up onto the far bank, the Jordan closed behind them. The river resumed its ordinary movement as if nothing had interrupted it. Only the damp stones beneath their feet remained as proof of what had just taken place. They climbed up from the riverbed to higher ground on the eastern bank. Here the wilderness took over in full, rocky rises and sparse, scattered growth, a place of solitude, where the boundary between heaven and earth seemed thinner than elsewhere. Elijah turned to face his companion. Years of traveling together had brought them to this exact moment. His earthly ministry had run its full course. The time had come to pass what he carried into younger and readier hands. "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elijah asked. The question hung in the dry desert air, like a sacred and open invitation. One final gift offered by a teacher to his student. Whatever Elisha named, if it aligned with divine will, would be granted before their parting. Elisha's answer exposed the depth of his calling and the scale of his faith. He did not reach for wealth or long life or any form of earthly authority. His request pointed entirely to the spiritual. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," he said. In the inheritance customs of ancient Israel, the firstborn son received twice the portion given to each of the other children. Elisha was asking to be recognized as Elijah's true spiritual heir. He wanted to carry on the prophetic ministry with an even greater endowment of power than his master had been given. The request was simultaneously humble and breathtaking. Humble in its recognition of Elijah's superior standing as master and mentor. Breathtaking in its reach for a supernatural gift that no human being could bestow. Elijah's response showed both genuine warmth and honest realism. "You have asked a difficult thing. Yet, if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." The condition was simple and direct. If Elisha kept his eyes on his master at the moment of departure, the double portion would be given. If not, the request would go unfulfilled. The outcome rested with divine sovereignty. They continued walking side by side through the wilderness. Words became unnecessary. Both understood what lay ahead. Everything that needed saying had been said. Now they simply waited for God's timing. The landscape around them felt charged with anticipation. Every stone and clump of brush seemed to be holding very still. Creation itself appeared to recognize that something without precedent was near. Behind them, the Jordan moved normally again. Ahead stretched territory few had ever crossed. They walked toward a horizon that would soon show things no human eye had ever witnessed. Elisha stayed close to his master, holding the condition given to him firmly in his attention. He must witness whatever was about to happen or lose the inheritance he had asked for. His gaze stayed fixed on Elijah. The sun pressed higher into the desert sky. Heat began to tremble off the surrounding rocks, but neither man was paying attention to ordinary discomforts. They were walking toward eternity, and earthly concerns had dissolved behind them. Soon the moment would come. Heaven would reach down to claim its servant, earth would lose one of its greatest prophets, and Elisha would discover whether his faith could hold steady enough to witness divine intervention face to face. The final miracle was drawing close. The most remarkable departure in all of human history was about to unfold. Two men moving together toward a destiny that would permanently alter both of their lives. The fiery departure. The morning air lay still over the Jordan Valley. Elijah walked alongside his faithful companion, their sandals pressing softly against the dusty trail. Both men knew this day carried something the others had not. Something sacred moved through the atmosphere around them. Elisha stayed close at his teacher's side. 3 times his master had tried to leave him behind, but loyalty holds on firmly when letting go feels like loss. The younger prophet had already sensed what was approaching. Heaven itself seemed to breathe hints of it into the passing breeze. They came to where the reeds swayed gently in the river's current. Elijah took hold of his cloak, that same rough garment that had kept him through years of desert wandering. He rolled it with care, his weathered hands moving deliberately. The water ahead ran wide and deep. No shallow place offered passage, no crossing existed for travelers on foot. But Elijah lifted the cloak high and brought it down hard against the surface. The river split apart. Water rose in walls on either side, leaving dry ground running clean and straight between them. The same God who had once opened the sea for Moses now carved a path for his prophet. Elijah stepped forward without hesitation. Elisha followed close behind. Their feet pressed down on riverbed stones that had lain hidden under rushing water just a breath before. Fish flopped in shallow remnants. Mud gave softly under their sandals. The sound of held-back water enclosed them from both sides like a low and distant rumble. On the far bank they climbed upward. Elisha brushed dust from his robe. Elijah looked back at the Jordan, already flowing in its normal course again. The miracle had been quiet, unhurried. No audience had gathered to watch. No signal had announced it. They walked on together through sparse brush and scattered stone. The sun continued climbing. Heat shimmered off the distant ridges. But Elijah's step grew noticeably lighter with each pace, as though invisible wings had already begun their slow work of lifting him. "Ask what you want before I'm taken from you," Elijah said suddenly. His voice carried both a quiet sadness and a thread of hope, a teacher's last and best gift offered to his student. Elisha did not pause to think. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." The words rose from somewhere deeper than careful consideration. He was not asking for recognition or influence. He wanted to serve God with the same consuming fire that had driven his master through every year of his calling. Elijah's expression softened. "You've asked for something difficult, but if you see me, when I'm taken, you'll receive it." They kept moving. The land extended empty in every direction around them. No trees offered shade. No structure broke the flat edge of the horizon. Just two men sharing the last of their time together on this earth. Then it happened. A sound like rushing wind swept through the air, yet no grass bent beneath it. No dust lifted from the ground. The sound arrived from somewhere entirely outside the physical world. Horses appeared first, not creatures of flesh and blood, but beings formed of fire and light. Their manes moved like living flame. Their hooves threw sparks against invisible surfaces. Behind them rolled a chariot burning more brightly than the full face of the sun. Elisha dropped to his knees. His eyes went wide with terror and wonder together. The horses reared, their fiery shapes rising and dancing against the open blue. The chariot wheels turned at a speed beyond anything natural. A whirlwind began gathering itself out of the clear air, not the destroying kind that levels fields and tears down walls, but a wind carrying the very breath of heaven within it. It descended slowly and with clear intention, wrapping itself around Elijah the way gentle hands might hold something precious. The old prophet turned his face back one last time. His eyes found Elisha's. Something passed between them in that look. Love, gratitude, the bond between teacher and student that no force can dissolve. Then the whirlwind lifted him. His feet separated from the ground. His cloak caught the supernatural current and fluttered upward. Higher and higher he rose, enclosed in fire and celestial brilliance. My father, Elisha cried out, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." His voice broke between grief and awe. The man who had been to him everything a father is, was ascending into glory before his eyes. The whirlwind spun faster. Elijah's figure grew smaller. The horses drove upward, pulling their blazing chariot toward realms no human eye could follow. The sound of their movement faded like distant drums, growing quieter, and then silence. The whirlwind dissolved. The horses were gone. The chariot vanished back into mystery. Elijah had been taken up, removed from the earth, without passing through the doorway of death. Only the impression of fire remained, seared permanently into the memory Elisha would carry until his own final breath. Something fell through the empty air above. Elijah's cloak drifted downward like a bird descending to rest, settling softly on the ground among the scattered rocks. The rough fabric showed no sign at all of the supernatural fire it had passed through. Yet it carried all of the authority that had once rested on the man who wore it. Elisha gathered it up with hands that trembled. The cloak felt ordinary against his palms, just wool and thread, worn smooth from long use, mended here and there where the fabric had given way. But he understood what he held. This simple garment now bore the power of God. His prayer had been answered, the double portion had been given. He looked up one final time, searching the broad sweep of blue sky for any remaining trace of his master. Nothing was there, only peaceful sky and drifting cloud. Elijah had crossed into eternity. He had left behind only questions, only memories, and the sacred weight of responsibility now pressing down on the shoulders of the man who stood alone in the wilderness, holding a worn cloak that had once belonged to the greatest prophet Israel had ever known. The heaviness of it pressed into his palms, not the weight of fabric, but the density of calling. Around him the world continued exactly as it had before. Bees moved through wild flowers. Lizards crossed quickly between stones. The Jordan ran peacefully at its distance, the same river that had divided twice in one day in honor of God's servants. But everything was different now. Elisha was no longer the student stepping along in his master's wake. He was the prophet, the one to whom people would bring their impossible troubles and their last desperate prayers. The living bridge between heaven and a world in need of what only heaven could provide. He folded the cloak carefully and tucked it under his arm. Time to return across the river, time to begin walking his own path as God's appointed messenger. The fire horses had gone, but their invisible hoof prints remained pressed into his memory, carrying the assurance that heaven was always nearer than it appeared. Elisha strikes the water. The walk back toward the Jordan felt longer than the walk away from it had been. Each step carried Elisha further from the place where heaven had reached down and touched the earth. His teacher was gone. The supernatural fire had faded. Only ordinary ground and ordinary sky surrounded him now. But the cloak folded under his arm had its own quiet voice. This simple piece of cloth had once parted the waters of the Jordan. Would it do so a second time? Elisha turned the question over as he walked. He wondered whether God's power truly lived in the fabric itself, or whether faith was the real door that opened what seemed impossible. The river came into view, moving peacefully between its familiar banks. Cattails dipped in the shallow edges, water bugs skated lazy circles on the surface. Everything looked entirely normal, almost plain. After watching chariots made of fire ascend into the sky, here was the Jordan, the same river that had parted just hours before, flowing as though nothing out of the ordinary had ever taken place. He stood at the water's edge in the precise spot where he and Elijah had crossed together that same morning. The Jordan had kept its secrets well. No trace of any miracle remained visible in the current. He unfolded the cloak slowly. The fabric pressed rough against his palms, worn thin in places, stitched back together in others with careful and patient work. Nothing about its appearance suggested anything beyond the ordinary. It could have been any poor man's garment. Doubt found a foothold in his thoughts. What if the power had ascended with Elijah and was now beyond reach? What if the cloak was nothing more than cloth now, emptied of whatever had once made it extraordinary? What if he stood at the water's edge alone, holding a faded promise and nothing more? But then he let himself remember. The whirlwind, the fire horses, the way his master had been lifted without a shadow of fear crossing his face. The God who had taken Elijah upward was the very same God who had promised a double portion to the one who watched and believed. Elisha raised the cloak above his head. "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" He called out across the moving water. His voice carried both question and declaration in the same breath. Both honest doubt and determined faith held together without apology. He brought the cloak down hard against the river's surface. The water stopped. It gathered itself into walls on both sides, opening a path of dry ground straight across. Fish hung still in the liquid walls, their silver bodies catching light. Stones that had not felt open air in memory lay bare and gleaming on the exposed bed. Elisha stared in wonder. The miracle had happened again. Not because of anything particular about the cloak itself, but because of the God who chose to honor faith when it was expressed through simple and obedient action. The double portion was real. He stepped onto the riverbed with steadily growing confidence. His feet settled on the smooth stones. The muffled roar of water held at bay, pressed in from both sides. Above his head, the river walls caught and scattered sunlight in shifting patterns. Below his sandals, the stones were cool and firm. This was his first miracle as a prophet, standing in his own right. Not Elijah's student trailing a step behind, but Elisha the prophet, the one appointed to carry divine power into a world full of broken and desperate people. Each step across the dry bed confirmed his new identity. On the far shore, a group of men stood waiting. The sons of the prophets from Jericho had been watching from their distance. They had seen Elijah taken up. They had seen the river part twice in the same day. Now they looked at Elisha with completely different eyes. "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha," one of them said to another. The words moved quickly among them. Their voices held unmistakable awe. The mantle of prophecy had passed to hands that were ready to hold it. But some among them found it difficult to accept what they had witnessed. Death was understood to be final. People did not simply disappear into whirlwinds. Surely Elijah's body had come down somewhere. Surely the wind had deposited him in some remote and hidden valley where he lay still and undiscovered. 50 strong men came forward to Elisha with a proposal. "Let us go and search for your master," they said. "Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has picked him up and set him down on some mountain or in some valley." Elisha shook his head. He had watched his teacher ascend into heaven with his own eyes. No earthly search party would uncover what had passed beyond the physical world entirely. "Don't send them," he said with quiet firmness. They persisted. 50 men with sincere intentions but incomplete understanding. They pressed and urged until Elisha at last agreed. "Send them," he said, knowing their 3 days would find nothing, but understanding that sometimes a person must arrive at truth through their own experience, rather than through the words of someone who already knows. 3 days they covered the terrain, up into mountains and down into valleys, through caves and across ridges and along every path where a body might have fallen or rested. They found nothing at all, because there was nothing of that kind to find. When they returned without success, Elisha received them without any note of pride. "Didn't I tell you not to go?" he said simply. The failed search accomplished its purpose. Those 50 men now understood at a depth they could not have reached through testimony alone that something entirely without precedent had occurred. Elijah had not been moved to another location. He had been translated, carried from the earth to heaven, without ever passing through death's ordinary door. This understanding spread through the communities of prophets. From Jericho to Bethel to Gilgal, the story traveled. The God of Israel had done something new. A servant so faithful and so fully surrendered that the normal ending had been bypassed altogether. For Elisha, the returning searchers brought a kind of closure. No lingering question remained about what had become of his master. No silent wondering about whether the whirlwind had been real. The failed search confirmed what his heart had known from the moment the sky went quiet. Elijah was beyond any human reach now, living in dimensions where only spirits could follow. The cloak in his hands felt different after that. Not simply a garment passed from one set of hands to another, but a mark of divine appointment. God had chosen him deliberately to continue what Elijah had begun. The parting of the river had been heaven's public endorsement of that transfer. As evening came on slowly over the valley, Elisha walked toward Jericho. Behind him, the Jordan ran quietly, keeping everything it knew. Ahead lay a city full of living people, carrying burdens that only God had the answer for. His work had only just started. The double portion was never intended to mean performing twice the number of miracles Elijah had performed. It meant inheriting the fullness of his master's spiritual authority, the capacity to stand between heaven and earth and carry divine solutions into the place where human struggles lived. Night settled gently across the valley. Stars emerged one at a time in the darkening expanse above. Somewhere among those distant lights, Elisha believed his teacher dwelt in a glory beyond all description. The thought brought with it both comfort and the courage required for everything that lay ahead. Healing a spring. Jericho lay sleeping peacefully under the spread of stars when Elisha arrived. The ancient city had lived through many upheavals, walls that had once fallen to the sound of trumpets, curses spoken and eventually lifted, generations arriving and departing within its boundaries. Now it faced a quieter kind of trouble, one that threatened life gradually, rather than in any sudden and dramatic way. Morning brought the city's elders to Elisha's door. The worry in their faces had been etched there over months of growing anxiety. "Our Lord," they said with genuine respect, "this city sits in a pleasant place, as you can see, but the water is bad and the land is unproductive." Elisha followed them through the streets of Jericho. Children played in dusty courtyards. Women swept the stones before their doorways. Men set themselves to the work of another day. Life continued moving forward, but a shadow of difficulty lay just beneath the surface of all those ordinary routines. They brought him to the spring that supplied the entire city with water. It rose from deep underground, a natural fountain that by all rights should have been a source of constant blessing. Instead, something in its flow carried harm. The water looked clear enough, sparkling as it caught the morning light. But animals that drank from it became sick. Crops watered from this source failed before they could bear fruit. What should have been life was becoming slow death instead. Elisha knelt beside the water and cupped some in his palm. The smell was wrong. Not the clean and open scent of healthy water, but something sharp and bitter underneath. Whatever dissolved in it had turned blessing into curse, making the spring useless for the very thing it had been created to do. "Bring me a new bowl," he said to the waiting men. "Put salt in it." The request struck them as unusual. Salt ordinarily made water less fit to drink, not more. But these elders had witnessed the Jordan divide the day before. They trusted this young prophet's unconventional approach. They went and came back quickly, carrying a clay bowl that had never been used, filled with coarse salt of the kind used for preserving meat and cleaning wounds. White crystals caught the morning light like tiny scattered gems. Elisha carried the bowl to the place where the spring bubbled up from its hidden depths, bringing up with it whatever contamination lay buried in the earth far below. This was where the healing had to begin, at the source of the problem, not somewhere downstream of it. He poured the salt directly into the upwelling water. The crystals disappeared at once, dissolving into the rising current. For a moment, nothing appeared to change. The spring went on flowing exactly as it had for months. Then Elisha spoke words that carried heaven's full authority. "This is what the Lord says. I have healed this water. Never again will it cause death or make the land unproductive." The change was not visible in that instant. Water does not announce its healing with any outward display or dramatic sign, but something fundamental shifted in that moment. The poison that had infected the spring was gone, neutralized by God's power working through the most common of all everyday minerals. Within hours, the difference made itself plain. Animals approached the spring without hesitation and drank deeply with no ill effect. The water tasted clean and fresh and right. Plants that had been weakening began to show the first signs of recovery. Word spread through Jericho the way water spreads when a vessel tips over, quickly reaching every corner. The spring was healed. The curse had been broken. Life could take hold and flourish again in their pleasant city. Children ran to taste it for themselves. Adults filled their jars with a confidence they had not felt in months. But the real miracle was never simply the healing itself. It was the means God had chosen to bring it about. Salt, the most common of all preserving agents, had become the instrument of full restoration. The most ordinary thing imaginable, transformed by divine purpose into something that accomplished the extraordinary. This gentleness set the tone for Elisha's entire ministry from the very beginning. Where Elijah had called fire down from heaven, Elisha brought healing through everyday elements. His power worked quietly and without spectacle, restoring what had been broken rather than breaking what still stood. The salt had done more than purify contaminated water. It stood as a symbol of what this new phase of prophetic ministry would look like. One that brought seasoning and hope into bitter places rather than judgment upon them. Months passed, and the spring held its purity without any sign of returning to its former condition. Seasons turned, and still the water ran clean and life-giving. The healing proved permanent and complete, a lasting demonstration of God's faithfulness to every word he spoke. What he restored, he kept restored. Children who had grown up knowing only the bitter water grew strong, drinking from the healed spring. Fields watered from its flow began producing in abundance. The land that had been unproductive began bearing results that could not be attributed to any human effort. The miracle became part of Jericho's story, passed from parents to children as the years rolled forward. Remember when the spring ran bitter, people would say to one another, "Remember when the prophet came with salt and spoke the word of God? Remember how everything changed." For Elisha, that first miracle in his immediate area established the patterns that would define his entire calling. He would be the prophet of restoration, the one who carried healing to ordinary and daily problems, not through confrontation and spectacle, but through quiet interventions that gave life back to what had lost it. The empty bowl remained in his dwelling as a quiet reminder, such an unremarkable vessel used for such a profound purpose. It said something true about the way God worked. No tool was too common, no person too plain or ordinary when heaven had decided to work through them. The elders of Jericho came to Elisha regularly after that, each time bringing news of the spring's continued purity. Each report confirmed what they had all witnessed. God's power at work through his chosen servant to heal what no human ingenuity could have repaired. As night fell over the city and families drew water for their evening meals without any trace of worry, the spring bubbled on its quiet way. Its sound had something like gentle laughter in it now, after months of carrying only sadness. Clean water moved toward every home in the city, carrying life through every channel. Elisha listened to that sound as he readied himself for sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own new challenges and its own fresh chances to serve as God's agent of restoration. But tonight, Jericho rested soundly, knowing its spring ran pure, and its prophet walked among them with heaven's authority resting quietly in his hands. Bears and mockers. The road from Jericho climbed upward through rocky country toward Bethel, winding between the stones with the particular kind of patience that old roads develop over long centuries. Elisha walked it alone, his staff tapping against the ground with each measured step. The morning sun stretched long shadows before him as he made his way toward the ancient city where God's people had once offered genuine worship before corruption moved in to take up residence. Bethel carried deep meaning in the history of Israel. Here Jacob had slept and dreamed of a ladder reaching into heaven, with angels ascending and descending upon it. Here God had spoken his covenant promises to the patriarch with solemn clarity. But more recent years had brought spiritual rot to this once holy place. Golden calves now occupied spaces where pure worship had once been offered without shame. As Elisha approached the city's outer edge, the sound of young voices reached him on the wind. A group of boys had gathered near the road, somewhere between 20 and 30 of them, ranging in age from young children to those old enough to know considerably better. They had been waiting, from all appearances, watching for the prophet's approach. The moment they spotted him cresting the hill, their voices rose in coordinated mockery. "Go on up, you bald head," they shouted with cruel laughter ringing through the air. "Go on up, you bald head. The words cut with a precision beyond ordinary name-calling. "Go on up" referred directly to Elijah's recent ascension, something these young people had heard about and chosen deliberately to treat as a subject for ridicule. This was not simple teasing about a man's appearance. This was contempt aimed at the very power of God that had lifted his prophet into heaven. They weren't just mocking Elisha, they were mocking the God who had sent him. Elisha stopped walking. The jeering grew louder and bolder as the group sensed no immediate response. Some of the boys threw small stones that kicked up dust around his feet. Others made crude gestures, their faces carrying that particular cruelty that sometimes gathers in groups of young people who have never been taught where their own limits end. This was not innocent childhood foolishness. These were young people of an age to understand what respect required, old enough to know the difference between careless play and deliberate contempt. Their behavior reflected the same spiritual decay that had infected Bethel itself, a city that had once known the living God and had turned its back on him in favor of golden substitutes. The prophet turned to face the group. No anger showed in his expression, but something far more sobering was there instead. The quiet weight of divine authority. When heaven's representative is treated with open scorn, heaven itself is not indifferent to the fact. "In the name of the Lord," Elisha pronounced. His voice was not raised, but it carried across the hillside with a clarity that stopped every sound around it. The mockery went silent instantly, the laughter cut off. His words settled over the group like something heavy and unavoidable. The boys looked at one another with sudden uncertainty. Something in the prophet's voice had altered the atmosphere entirely. The morning air went very still. Even the birds had stopped calling. Creation itself seemed to draw a long breath and hold it. Then came sounds from the nearby forest. Branches snapping under considerable weight, heavy footsteps pressing through undergrowth, low growls that lifted the hair along the back of every neck within hearing. 2 bears came out of the trees. Their massive shapes moved with a speed that surprised everyone who saw it. The laughter became screaming. The group scattered in every possible direction, but bears move at a pace that running boys cannot match. The animals struck with a precise and overwhelming efficiency, their claws and teeth finding their marks with force enough to leave lasting evidence of the encounter. When it was over, 42 of the young mockers lay injured, some severely, others bearing marks that would remain visible for the rest of their lives. The bears returned to the forest as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind a scene that would be recounted in that region for generations. Elisha felt no satisfaction in what had occurred. This had not been personal revenge. It had been divine judgment falling upon those who had chosen to despise the authority that heaven had placed in its appointed servant. The bears had not arrived because a man felt insulted. They had come because the honor of God himself had been publicly trampled. The few boys who had escaped without injury ran back toward Bethel, their voices rising in panic. Word moved through the city rapidly. The new prophet was not a figure anyone could treat carelessly. The same God who had lifted Elijah into heaven in a chariot of fire had sent forest animals to defend the honor of his representative. This single incident would shape how people approached Elisha for the remainder of his entire ministry. Word traveled to every city in Israel. To mock God's prophet carried consequences that could not be predicted or controlled. But the bears had served a purpose that extended beyond punishment. They demonstrated that God's power was not limited to spectacular miracles performed willingly through chosen instruments. Even wild animals moved at heaven's direction when earthly authority and honor were being treated with contempt. The created world itself answered to the voice of its creator. The wounded boys would heal over time, but the scars would continue speaking long after the pain had faded, reminding both them and all who heard the story that some boundaries carry real weight. Respect for God's messengers was not a social nicety. It was a matter of actual spiritual consequence. News of the encounter reached King Joram in Samaria within days. Palace officials exchanged quiet words about the new prophet who could heal contaminated springs and also summon bears from the forest. Even those who had chosen skepticism found themselves reconsidering. The religious officials in Bethel were not unmoved either. Their golden calves suddenly seemed considerably less impressive when measured against a God who deployed the natural world in defense of his servants. Some among them began to quietly wonder whether their current practices deserved a second and more honest look. For Elisha, the morning's harsh events brought no pleasure. He had not gone looking for a confrontation with a group of young people, but he understood that the role of prophet required him to stand for divine authority, even when doing so led to painful outcomes for those who had chosen rebellion over respect. The road to Bethel stretched ahead of him, quieter now. No further voices gathered to test his resolve. The city's gates stood open before him, but those watching from the walls and from windows looked upon him with eyes that held something they had not carried before. A mixture of fear and the beginning of genuine respect. As he passed through the gates of Bethel, Elisha let his mind settle on the morning's sharp lesson. God's mercy was real and inexhaustible, flowing freely like water from a healed spring to every heart that received it willingly. But his justice was equally real, arriving as swiftly and certainly as bears from a forest when his honor was treated with deliberate contempt. Both aspects pointed toward the same end, calling people back to the God who loved them thoroughly enough to discipline them when love required it. Behind him, the forest had gone quiet again. The bears had returned to their own rhythms, their unusual and purposeful service finished. But the memory of how suddenly and completely they had appeared would remain in Bethel for years to come. A standing reminder that God's prophets walked with heaven's full protection, surrounding them at every step. 3 kings and a prophet. The message arrived at first light, delivered by a breathless rider whose horse had pushed through the darkness without rest. 3 kings were in desperate need of a prophet's counsel. Their circumstances had turned dire. Their armies were perishing from thirst in a wilderness that offered no mercy. King Joram of Israel had persuaded King Jehoshaphat of Judah to stand beside him in a campaign against Moab. The Moabites had risen in defiance, refusing to deliver the tribute of sheep and wool they owed. It appeared straightforward enough. March southward, crush the rebellion, and restore the proper order of things. Jehoshaphat had proposed adding the king of Edom as a third ally. More fighting men meant faster victory, or so their thinking went. Surely 3 united armies would crush whatever resistance Moab could possibly raise. But the path they had chosen wound through wilderness that stretched far beyond what their maps and planning had accounted for. 7 days of relentless marching beneath a merciless sun had stripped their water supplies down to nothing. Now 3 armies stared down death, not at the edge of enemy blades, but at the slow cruelty of thirst. Elisha found the kings encamped in a barren hollow, where no spring ran and no well offered relief. Tens of thousands of soldiers huddled in whatever thin shade they could find, their tongues swollen and their strength draining away. Horses drooped their heads in exhaustion. The army was quietly becoming a field of graves. King Joram spoke first, his voice raw and cracked with desperation. Had the Lord brought 3 kings together only to hand them over to Moab? Fear had swallowed his earlier boldness whole. Ahab's son now saw his father's enemies lurking in every shadow around him. Elisha studied this grandson of Omri with eyes that saw beneath royal garments to the true condition of the heart. "Why are you coming to me?" he asked plainly. "Go to the prophets of your father and the prophets of your mother." His words carried a pointed edge. This was the family line that had spread Baal worship like a sickness across all of Israel. But Jehoshaphat, the faithful king of Judah, stood between them. His presence changed the entire shape of things. "No," Joram answered, desperation overriding whatever pride he had left. "It was the Lord who brought us 3 kings here together, and now he is about to hand us over to Moab." The prophet's expression shifted, growing slightly softer when his eyes moved to Jehoshaphat. Here stood a king who still honored the God of their ancestors, a man who sought divine wisdom rather than leaning only on political maneuvering. "As surely as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve," Elisha declared, "if I did not have regard for the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not even look at you or take notice of you." What Elisha requested next left everyone standing there puzzled. "Bring me a harpist," he said. Music seemed entirely beside the point when entire armies were dying of thirst. But the prophet understood something about opening himself to divine inspiration that these kings had never grasped. A skilled musician was located among the soldiers, perhaps a Levite who had served in temple worship before being pressed into military service. His fingers found the familiar strings, and gentle music began drifting across that desperate camp. The music carved out a space where heaven's voice could be heard above the noise of human need. As the harpist played, something shifted in Elisha's bearing. The hand of the Lord came upon him, that mysterious contact that opened prophetic sight and revealed heaven's solutions to impossible circumstances. His eyes took on a faraway quality, seeing past the physical world into the purposes of God. "This is what the Lord says," Elisha began, his voice carrying authority it had not held moments before. "I will fill this valley with pools of water. You will see no wind, you will see no rain, yet this valley will be filled with water, and you, your cattle, and your other animals will all drink." The promise bordered on the impossible. Valleys did not fill with water when no storm was visible and no rain had fallen. Springs did not appear overnight in desert places. Yet the God who had divided rivers and sweetened bitter springs could certainly bring water to a waterless valley. "This is an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord," the prophet continued. "He will also hand Moab over to you. You will overthrow every fortified city and every major town. You will cut down every good tree, stop up all the springs, and ruin every good field by covering it with stones." The following morning brought fulfillment beyond anything they had dared to imagine. Sunrise revealed pools of clear water spread throughout the valley, not mere puddles, but deep reservoirs that reflected the sky like scattered mirrors across the ground. No storm had moved through, no rainfall had come. Yet water stretched across the land as far as any eye could see. The armies drank deeply, strength flooding back through their bodies with every swallow. Horses plunged their muzzles into the cool water and drank until their sides rounded out. Pack animals took their fill. A valley that had nearly become a graveyard had become an oasis of life. But the miracle carried a second purpose, beyond simply saving the Allied armies. The morning light striking those pools of water created an illusion that would decide the battle before a single weapon was raised. Across the border, Moabite scouts brought strange tidings to their king. The valley where the enemy armies were camped appeared to be flooded with blood. Water catching the reddish hue of dawn looked like vast pools of gore spread across the desert floor. "The kings must have fought among themselves," the Moabites concluded with rising excitement. "Their armies must have turned on each other during the night. They are all dead, and their wealth is just sitting there unguarded." Rather than forming battle lines, the Moabites rushed toward what they believed would be an easy harvest of plunder. They came as looters rather than warriors, thinking only of the treasure waiting among the scattered dead. The trap was perfect. When the Moabites arrived in the valley, they found not corpses, but rested living armies ready and waiting for a fight. What had appeared to be blood was clearly water now, but the deception had already done its work. Moab's forces were scattered and completely unprepared when the assault began. The victory was thorough and overwhelming. Just as Elisha had foretold, every fortified city fell. Trees that had stood for generations were cut down. Springs were sealed. Good fields were buried under stones. Moab learned the full price of defying the God of Israel. For the three kings, the campaign became an unforgettable lesson in divine power. Jehoshaphat returned to Jerusalem with his faith in God renewed, a God who could produce water in desert places and deliver victory from seemingly hopeless situations. Even Joram, son of the wicked Ahab, had witnessed something that shook his confidence in Baal worship. The prophet he had initially dismissed had rescued 3 armies from certain death and delivered them total victory over their enemies. The dry valley where they had faced death became a permanent landmark in the memory of all who had been there. The people of the surrounding area would point to the place and tell the story for generations to come. When the impossible becomes reality, it leaves behind marks that time cannot fully erase. The widow's oil. The woman arrived at evening, when long shadows stretched across Elisha's courtyard. Her clothing told of poverty that had come upon her recently. Fabric that had once been fine now bore the marks of careful mending and the gentle fading that comes with reduced circumstances, though her bearing still carried dignity, the quiet strength of someone fighting honorable battles. "Your servant's husband is dead," she began, her voice steady despite the grief still raw in her eyes. "And you know that he revered the Lord, but now a creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves." Elisha knew her husband well, one of the sons of the prophets, a man who had served God faithfully while receiving little earthly reward for his devotion. Such men often died young, worn thin by the demands of spiritual service and the hardship of living by faith rather than worldly calculation. The creditor's claim was entirely legal under the laws of the time. When a man died in debt, his family's options were narrow. Property could be claimed, possessions seized. If those amounts were still not sufficient, children could be taken as bondservants until the obligation had been worked off through their labor. For a widow, losing her sons meant losing everything. They were her only hope for support in old age, her only protection in a world that offered very little security to women alone. Without them, she faced a future of begging or slow starvation. "How can I help you?" Elisha asked, though her poverty was written clearly across every detail of her appearance. "Tell me, what do you have in your house?" The question must have felt cruel at first. If she had possessed anything of value, she surely would have sold it already to settle her debts. But the prophet had learned to search for the seed of a miracle even in the smallest of beginnings. "Your servant has nothing there at all," she answered, then paused as if turning through her memory, except a small jar of olive oil. Such a tiny thing, barely enough oil to cook a single meal or keep a lamp burning for a few hours. In a home stripped bare by creditors, this one jar had somehow been overlooked, or perhaps deemed too worthless to bother claiming. Yet in God's way of measuring things, the smallest seed could yield the greatest harvest. "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars," Elisha instructed. "Don't ask for just a few. Collect as many as you can possibly find, from every home, every family willing to lend them." The woman stared at him, uncertain. Empty jars served no obvious purpose when the problem was having nothing to put inside them. But she had come seeking a miracle, and prophets sometimes gave instructions that only made sense when looking back from the other side of obedience. "Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons," he continued. "Pour oil into all the jars, and as each one is filled, set it aside." Faith required action, even when the action seemed foolish by every ordinary measure. The widow bowed respectfully and went to do as the prophet had said. If God's servant was telling her that empty jars could solve her problem, then empty jars she would gather. She spent the following day visiting every neighbor she knew, explaining her need without shame. "May I borrow your empty jars?" she asked, at door after door. "The prophet has told me to collect as many as possible." The neighbors responded with surprising generosity. Perhaps they remembered her husband's kindness to them. Perhaps the desperation in her voice touched hearts that might otherwise have stayed closed. Jars began arriving at her house, clay vessels of every size and shape, clean and waiting for whatever purpose she had in mind. When evening fell, her small home overflowed with borrowed containers. Large storage jars stood beside the smaller vessels used in daily cooking. Wine jars waited next to water pots. The collection filled every space available, an army of emptiness waiting to be made full. The widow gathered her 2 sons around her. The prophet had said to shut the door, she reminded them. This miracle, whatever form it would take, would happen in private. No crowd would gather to watch. No announcement would be made beforehand. Just a desperate mother and her children, surrounded by empty jars, armed with nothing but impossible hope. She lifted her tiny vessel of oil and began to pour. The golden liquid flowed into the first jar, far more than her small container should have been able to hold. She kept pouring, and the oil kept flowing, well beyond anything that the laws of ordinary containers could explain. The first jar filled to its brim. Her little vessel still showed oil remaining. She moved to the second jar, then the third. Each container received its full measure, while her original supply seemed untouched by what it had given away. Her sons watched with growing amazement as jar after jar was filled with pure olive oil. The small room began to take on the smell of an olive press at the height of harvest. Golden liquid caught the lamplight and threw dancing reflections across the walls. "Bring me another jar," she called to her older son when one vessel was filled. He handed her the next, his eyes wide with wonder. The oil continued flowing as if her tiny jar contained an entire ocean of liquid gold. Hours passed. The work continued. Every borrowed container received its portion until the small house held nothing but full jars of oil, rich and pure, the kind that commanded good prices in any market. Finally, when the last jar had been filled to its brim, the widow looked around for another vessel to fill. None remained empty. Every container had received its measure. Only then did her original jar run dry, its supernatural supply exhausted precisely at the moment when no more containers waited to receive what it had to give. The oil stopped, she whispered to her sons, though they could see it plainly for themselves. The miracle had boundaries, not because God's power was limited, but because her faith had been measured by the number of jars she had gathered. The capacity of her expectation had set the limit of her blessing. The next morning she hurried to Elisha with news of the night's wonder. "I did as you said," she reported breathlessly. "Every jar is full." The oil flowed until there were no empty vessels left. The prophet received her news with quiet satisfaction. "Go sell the oil and pay your debts," he told her. "You and your sons can live on what remains." The sale brought more money than she had dared hope for. High-quality olive oil commanded strong prices at market, and she had jar upon jar to offer. The debt that had threatened to enslave her children was paid in full, with enough left over to secure their future. Her sons remained free, their inheritance was preserved. The creditor received exactly what he was owed without complaint. Justice had been satisfied. Mercy had triumphed. A family that had been standing at the edge of destruction found itself standing on solid ground. The empty jars were returned to their owners with grateful thanks. But the story of what had happened inside that closed room spread through every household that had contributed vessels. The neighbors who had shown kindness by lending their containers now became witnesses to God's faithfulness. Word reached other widows in similar straits. If God could multiply oil for one desperate mother, perhaps he would show the same mercy to others. Hope began growing in places where despair had taken root. For Elisha, this miracle revealed the patterns that would mark his entire ministry. God's power moved through ordinary things: springs and salt, cloaks and bears, oil and empty jars. The supernatural pressed into the natural world at the exact points where genuine faith met desperate need. The widow's oil also laid bare a kind of divine mathematics. Where human reasoning saw only scarcity, heaven saw abundance, waiting to be released. A small jar became a fountain. Empty vessels became instruments of blessing. Profound need became the occasion for overwhelming provision. Years later, when her sons had grown to manhood and built families of their own, The widow still told the story of the night when oil had flowed like water. The miracle had preserved their lives, but its memory continued, blessing them long after the last jar had been sold. She kept one small vessel as a reminder, not the original jar that had held the supernatural supply, but one of the containers that had been filled that miraculous evening. When grandchildren came to visit, she would show them the ordinary clay pot and tell them about the night when God made empty things full. The Shunammite woman. The road from Mount Carmel to Samaria passed through Shunem, a well-kept town where solidly built homes lined clean streets and merchants conducted their business beneath the shade of flourishing trees. Here lived a woman whose generosity would earn her a permanent place in the sacred stories told across generations. She was wealthy by any honest measure, not only in land and gold, but in the deeper riches of wisdom and genuine kindness. Her husband was respected throughout the community. Their household was well ordered, their reputation without blemish. Yet for all their comfort, something was missing from their life together. When Elisha first came through Shunem, the woman noticed him at once. Something in the way he carried himself marked him as different from ordinary travelers. His clothing was plain but clean. His manner was peaceful yet purposeful. She sensed holiness in his presence, the way you sense the warmth of a fire before you can see the flames. "Come and have a meal," she urged him as he was passing her gate. Hospitality was a sacred duty in their culture, but her invitation carried warmth that went beyond mere obligation. She genuinely wanted to serve this holy man of God. The meal she set before him was generous and carefully prepared. Fresh bread, tender meat, vegetables from her own garden, wine brought up from her cellars. She served it with quiet joy, asking for nothing in return except the privilege of showing kindness to God's servant. Elisha accepted her hospitality with gratitude. The food was excellent, the conversation pleasant, and the home peaceful after the long days of traveling dusty roads and sleeping in rough accommodations. When he continued his journey, he carried warm memories of genuine welcome, but her kindness did not end with that single meal. Every time the prophet passed through Shunem, she invited him to stop and eat. What had begun as occasional hospitality became steady provision. Her table was always ready whenever God's servant came to town. "I know that this man who often comes our way is a holy man of God," she said to her husband one evening after Elisha had departed. "Let us make a small room on the roof and put in it a bed and a table, a chair and a lamp for him. Then he can stay there whenever he comes to us." Her husband agreed readily. His wife's spiritual perceptions had proven sound over many years of marriage. If she recognized genuine holiness in this traveling prophet, then they should provide for his needs as generously as they could. They built the upper room carefully, making it comfortable without being extravagant. A simple bed for rest, a table for meals or writing, a chair for sitting, a lamp for light. Everything a traveling prophet might need for refreshment and quiet study during his long journeys. When Elisha next visited Shunem, they showed him the prepared room. "This is for you," the woman said simply. "A quiet place to rest whenever your travels bring you our way." The prophet was deeply moved by their thoughtfulness. Many people offered meals or a place to sleep for the night, but few understood the deeper need of God's servant for a peaceful retreat, a place to pray and prepare for the work ahead. The upper room became a true sanctuary for Elisha. Here he could step away from the pressures and crowds, seeking God's direction in solitude. The lamp gave light for reading. The table held simple meals. The bed offered rest for his weary body. What can be done for this woman? Elisha asked his servant Gehazi one afternoon while enjoying the refuge she had prepared. Such extraordinary kindness called for recognition and some form of reward. "She has gone to all this trouble for us." Gehazi had been watching their hostess with practical eyes. "Well, she has no son and her husband is old," the servant noted. He understood the quiet sorrow that shadowed this comfortable household, the one emptiness that all their prosperity could not fill. In a society where sons provided security and carried on family names, childlessness was more than personal grief. It meant isolation in old age, the end of the family line, and unceasing worry about what lay ahead. Great wealth could not solve this deepest of needs. Elisha called the woman to stand in the doorway of his upper room. She came readily, most likely expecting some request for additional provisions or news about when he would be leaving. "About this time next year," he said, looking directly into her eyes, "you will hold a son in your arms." The words struck her like a physical blow. This was the one promise she had taught herself never to hope for. The blessing she had quietly accepted would never belong to her. Years of disappointment had built walls around her heart to protect it from exactly this kind of possibility. "No, my lord," she objected quickly. "Please, man of God, don't mislead your servant." The pain threading through her voice revealed how deeply this subject still wounded her. False hope felt crueler than honest despair. But Elisha spoke with prophetic certainty, not wishful thinking. God had shown him his intentions for this generous woman. Her kindness to his servant would be answered with the gift she most treasured, the one she had never dared to ask for. The months that followed tested her faith day after day. Could she trust what the prophet had spoken? Could she dare to hope for something she had wanted so desperately for so long? Her body began to show signs that seemed impossible after years of barrenness. When spring arrived and the time he had described drew near, she hardly allowed herself to believe what was happening. But labor pains do not lie, and the child growing within her was undeniably real. The prophet's word was being fulfilled exactly as he had spoken it. The birth was normal and healthy. She held her son in trembling arms, counting his tiny fingers and toes, marveling at the simple miracle of his being. The upper room, the very place where the promise had been given, seemed to resonate with thanksgiving. Her husband wept openly when he first held their child. His age had made fatherhood seem entirely beyond reach, but God's power had overruled what nature said was impossible. Their household, once marked by a quiet sadness that no one spoke of openly, now rang with laughter and new life. The boy grew strong and healthy, bringing joy that multiplied with each passing season. First steps, first words, first small attempts to help with the work of the household. Every milestone was precious beyond measuring to parents who had believed they would never know such experiences. Elisha continued using the upper room on his travels, but now his visits included time spent with the child whose very existence was a demonstration of God's faithfulness. The prophet who had announced the boy's coming watched him grow with something like paternal pride. The woman's faith deepened through motherhood. She had learned that God's promises, however impossible they appear, can be trusted completely. The boy playing in her courtyard was living proof that heaven hears the prayers of faithful hearts. Years passed peacefully in the comfortable house at Shunem. The boy grew tall and strong, beginning to help his father in the fields during harvest. The upper room remained ready for the prophet's visits, a continuing symbol of hospitality repaid far beyond what any generous heart could have imagined. But testing was coming that would stretch this family's faith beyond anything they could foresee. The child who had brought such joy would soon become the center of their gravest crisis, and the woman's relationship with God's prophet would face its ultimate hour. The boy lives again. Harvest season had arrived in Shunem with its familiar rhythm of hard labor and hopeful expectation. The Shunammite woman's son had grown into a healthy boy who loved nothing more than following his father out into the fields where workers cut grain under a blazing sky. The morning began like countless others during the harvest season. The boy ran ahead of the workers, his young energy boundless as he wove between the standing stalks. His laughter carried across the fields, mixing with the sound of scythes sweeping through grain and voices calling out across the open ground. But as the sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down with its full weight, something went wrong. The boy suddenly pressed his hands to his head and cried out in pain that had come with no warning whatsoever. "My head! My head!" His voice cut sharply through the noise of the harvest work. The reapers stopped their cutting. His father dropped his tools and ran to where his son had crumpled down among the grain. He gathered the boy carefully, feeling the fever burning through his small body. This was not ordinary fatigue from playing in the heat. Something serious was happening, something that sent a cold feeling through the father's chest, despite the scorching air around him. "Carry him to his mother," the father told one of his servants. The familiar comfort of home and a mother's care seemed the only thing that could help whatever had struck so suddenly and so severely. The servant moved quickly through the fields, carrying the precious burden with his head resting against the servant's shoulder. Each step seemed to deepen the child's distress. His breathing turned shallow. His skin burned with unnatural heat. The woman met them at the door, took one look at her son, and understood immediately that this was no minor sickness. She carried him up to the upper room, the quiet sanctuary where Elisha rested during his visits, the very place where this boy's life had first been promised. She laid him gently on the prophet's bed, the same piece of furniture where God's servant took his rest during his journeys. Perhaps some blessing still lingered in this space. Perhaps the holy man's presence had marked this room in ways that could help her dying child. The boy's breathing grew more labored. His fever climbed. She knelt beside the bed, holding his burning hands in hers, watching helplessly as life slipped away from the miracle child she had never expected to receive. At midday, he stopped breathing entirely. His small chest no longer moved. His hands grew still in hers. The son promised by God's own prophet, the child who had brought such deep joy to their household, lay dead on the bed where his life had first been foretold. She closed his eyes tenderly and arranged his limbs in quiet repose. Then she shut the door of the upper room and came back downstairs to find her husband. Her face showed such deliberate calm that he could sense something momentous had taken place. "Send me one of the servants and a donkey," she said evenly. "I need to go to the man of God quickly and return." Her husband looked at her with puzzled eyes. Today was neither the new moon nor the Sabbath, the customary times for seeking out prophets or making religious journeys. "Why go to him today?" he asked, unable to read the urgency behind her composed expression. "It will be all right," she replied, giving him nothing further about what lay behind the closed door upstairs. Some conversations would have to wait. Some crises demanded action before explanations. The servant prepared the donkey quickly, reading in her bearing that speed was essential. She mounted and set out toward Mount Carmel, where Elisha was known to spend time in prayer and solitude. "Drive fast," she urged the servant leading her mount. "Don't slow down unless I tell you." The distance between Shunem and Carmel had never felt so long. Every moment of delay felt like a kind of betrayal of the boy lying still in the upper room. Elisha spotted her coming while she was still a long way off. Something in the urgency of her approach sent a warning through his prophetic awareness. This was not a social call or a routine question. "Look," he said to his servant Gehazi, "there's the Shunammite. Run and meet her and ask her, 'Are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your child all right?'" Gehazi ran down the hillside to meet her before she reached the prophet. His questions came out breathlessly as he caught up with her donkey. "Everything is all right," she answered, but her eyes were fixed on Elisha, still waiting up the mountain. Her reply was technically true in the way that matters most. In God's economy, where death might not be the final word, everything could still be all right. She pushed past Gehazi and climbed the path to where Elisha waited. When she reached him, she fell at his feet and caught hold of them, her composure finally giving way beneath the weight of her grief. Gehazi moved to pull her back, thinking the behavior improper toward a man of God. But Elisha stopped him with a gesture. "Leave her alone," he said sharply. "She is in bitter distress, but the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me why." Then she spoke the words that explained everything. "Did I ask you for a son, my lord? Didn't I tell you don't raise my hopes?" The prophet understood at once. The child was dead. The miracle boy, whose birth had demonstrated God's faithfulness, now lay lifeless. And the woman who had never asked for a son was drowning in the pain of losing what she had learned to love more than anything. Elisha turned to Gehazi with rapid instructions. "Tuck your cloak into your belt, take my staff in your hand, and run. Don't greet anyone you meet, and if anyone greets you, do not answer. Lay my staff on the boy's face." But the mother would not be satisfied with a servant carrying a wooden staff. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live," she declared, "I will not leave you." If any hope of recovering her son existed, it rested with the prophet himself, not with his representative. Elisha read the fierce determination in her eyes and understood this mother would not be comforted with halfway measures or solutions handled by someone else. Her faith was in God's power working through his chosen servant, not in symbolic gestures carried at arm's length by others. Together, they made the journey back to Shunem, retracing the same road the woman had covered in desperate haste just hours earlier. Gehazi ran ahead with the staff, but both prophet and mother knew that the real confrontation with death was still waiting. When they arrived, Gehazi met them with news that fell like a stone. "The boy has not awakened," he reported. The staff had not restored life. Death still held its grip on the miracle child. Elisha went directly up to the upper room where the boy lay. He closed the door behind him, shutting out all distractions and human expectations. This battle would be fought in private, between God's servant and the ultimate enemy. The child lay exactly as his mother had left him, peaceful but without breath. Elisha knelt beside the small form and began to pray, pouring out his heart to the God who had promised this boy's birth and now seemed to have allowed his death. Then he did something remarkable. He lay down upon the child, placing his mouth against the boy's mouth, his eyes over the boy's eyes, his hands over the boy's hands. Flesh touched flesh. Life reached toward death with desperate intimacy. The child's body began to grow warm, but still no breath came. Elisha stood and walked back and forth across the room, praying continuously. Then he lay down on the boy a second time. This time something stirred within the small frame. Suddenly the boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Death released its hold. Breath returned to still lungs. The miracle of resurrection took place quietly, in an upper room where no crowd had gathered to witness the impossible. "Call the Shunammite," Elisha told Gehazi. When she came up the stairs, her heart hammering between hope and dread, the prophet said only, "Take your son." She fell at Elisha's feet in overwhelming gratitude, then gathered her living child into her arms. The boy who had died in the morning was alive in the evening, warm and breathing, and completely whole. The resurrection remained their secret at first. Some miracles are too sacred for immediate sharing with the world. But eventually, the story spread, adding another layer to Elisha's reputation as a prophet who carried God's authority over life and death itself. For the Shunammite woman, the lessons of that day would carry her faith through the rest of her life. God's gifts could be tested by terrible trials, but his power stood stronger than any enemy, even the last enemy of all. The son she had never asked for had been given to her twice, and both times the gift had come from the same faithful God. Naaman the leper. Far to the north, in the city of Damascus, the greatest military commander in Syria's army was losing a war he had no power to fight. Naaman commanded respect from kings and inspired fear in his enemies. But leprosy had declared its own campaign against his flesh, and no battle strategy he possessed could turn the tide. The disease had started quietly, just a patch of discolored skin he hoped might fade on its own. But leprosy never retreats of its own accord. It advanced steadily, claiming new ground on his arms and face, marking him as unclean in spite of all his power and position. In Naaman's household served a young Israelite girl, taken during one of Syria's border raids into enemy territory. She had been seized from her family and assigned to Naaman's wife as a household servant, one of thousands of nameless casualties in the endless conflicts between neighboring kingdoms. This girl had grown up on stories about Elisha, the prophet who had healed springs and raised dead children. Her faith had remained strong through her captivity. When she watched her master's condition grow visibly worse with each passing week, compassion moved through her in a way that overcame any resentment she might reasonably have harbored toward those who held her. "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria," she said to her mistress one morning while helping with household tasks. "He would cure him of his leprosy." She spoke with such quiet conviction that Naaman's wife brought the words directly to her husband. Here was hope arriving from an unexpected direction, from a captive slave whose people were enemies, yet whose concern appeared genuine and whose confidence seemed absolute. Naaman brought the girl's suggestion before the king of Syria, explaining how his young servant believed that Israel's prophet could heal leprosy. The idea seemed worth pursuing carefully. Losing his finest commander to a wasting disease would be a far greater strategic disaster than the cost of following up an unusual lead. The Syrian king composed a letter to the king of Israel. "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." He also sent a substantial tribute along with the request: 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing worthy of royalty. When the king of Israel received the letter and surveyed the staggering tribute accompanying it, he panicked completely. "Am I God?" he cried out, tearing his robes in distress. "Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this man send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." His reasoning, in its own way, followed a certain logic. Syria was clearly setting a trap. When Israel's king inevitably failed to cure an incurable disease, Syria would cry insult and launch another invasion. The entire arrangement felt like an elaborate provocation. But word of the king's distress reached Elisha quickly. "Why have you torn your robes?" The prophet sent word to ask, "Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel?" Naaman arrived at Elisha's house with considerable fanfare. Chariots and horses filled the street outside. Soldiers stood at attention. Servants carried the precious gifts. All of Damascus seemed to have descended on this one humble prophet's doorstep. But rather than hurrying out to receive such an important visitor, Elisha remained inside his house. He sent a messenger with simple instructions. "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." Naaman's face darkened with anger at what felt to him like deliberate insult. He had expected ceremony appropriate to a man of his rank, sacred rituals, dramatic prayers, the kind of treatment due to someone who commanded armies. At the very least, he had expected the prophet to step outside and acknowledge his presence personally. "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God." Naaman fumed to his servants, wave his hand over the spot, and cure the leprosy. The suggested remedy felt like an additional layer of insult. "Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel?" he demanded. "Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" Damascus could boast clear mountain streams that sparkled like crystal. The Jordan, by comparison, ran muddy and unremarkable. If washing in a river could cure leprosy, surely Syria's vastly superior waters would prove more effective than Israel's murky stream. He turned to leave in disgust, his pride stinging and his hopes in ruins. But his servants had served him long enough to speak honest counsel when it was needed most. These men loved their master more than they feared his displeasure, and they recognized opportunity where he was seeing only insult. "My father," one of them said gently, using a term of endearment that conveyed both deep respect and real affection. "If the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more, then, when he tells you, Wash and be cleansed. The reasoning was impossible to dismiss. Naaman had come prepared to attempt any cure, no matter how demanding or dangerous. Why refuse to try something simply because it appeared too straightforward? What exactly did he stand to lose, besides his pride? His anger slowly cooled as wisdom made its way through his wounded dignity. These servants had traveled with him across enemy territory, sharing every risk of this desperate journey. Their advice came from loyalty, not from disrespect. "You're right," he admitted finally. "If I was ready to attempt something difficult, why would I refuse something simple?" The decision to trust was slow in forming, fighting its way past layers of wounded pride and ingrained feelings of cultural superiority. But it came. The road to the Jordan took them through countryside that looked entirely ordinary, offering no dramatic scenery to suggest miraculous power was at work. The river itself, when they finally reached it, appeared disappointingly plain. Just water running between muddy banks, looking like nothing special at all. Naaman's servants helped him down to the water's edge. His leprosy had advanced to the point where even simple movements caused discomfort. The diseased patches on his arms and face showed the full extent of his condition in the open daylight. He waded into the river slowly, feeling the cool current rise around his legs. Nothing happened. No tingling sensation, no immediate sign of change. Just the murky Jordan water swirling around him like any other river he had ever crossed. He went under completely and came back up, counting silently. 1. The water streamed from his hair and beard. His skin looked exactly as diseased as it had before. His servants watched from the bank with visible anxiety. Down again, back up again. 2. The leprosy patches remained as prominent as ever. Doubt began whispering that the entire journey had been foolish from the very beginning. 3, 4, 5. Each immersion tested his willingness to continue a little more. His servants' faces showed increasing worry. Perhaps the Syrian rivers really would have been better after all. Perhaps this prophet was simply not what people claimed. 6 times beneath the surface, 6 times rising unchanged. 1 more remained. The final test of whether Israel's God could truly do what Syria's physicians had declared hopeless. Naaman drew a slow breath and went under the 7th time. When he came back up, gasping and clearing water from his eyes, the world had changed. The diseased patches were gone. His skin was clear and healthy, like the untouched skin of a young child. He stared at his own arms in pure astonishment. The leprosy that had been advancing steadily for months had vanished, without a trace, not gradually improved, but removed entirely and perfectly. His flesh was better than it had been before the disease had ever touched him. His servants shouted with joy and splashed into the river to embrace their master. The man they had watched suffer under leprosy's slow curse now stood before them utterly whole. The humble Jordan had accomplished what no river in Damascus ever could. Naaman's heart was flooded with emotions that went far deeper than words. Gratitude toward the prophet who had prescribed something so simple. Wonder at the God who commanded rivers to heal the incurable. And shame at his own earlier pride, his resistance to instructions that could not have been easier to follow. They returned directly to Elisha's house. But this time, Naaman approached as a changed man in ways that went well beyond his healed skin. His pride had been washed away along with his leprosy, replaced by humble recognition of a power he had not previously understood. "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel," he declared to the prophet. "Please accept now a gift from your servant." But Elisha refused everything offered to him. "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing," he said firmly. The healing had come as God's gift, not as a transaction to be settled with gold and silver. Naaman pressed him repeatedly. The prophet held firm. Finally, the Syrian general made a different kind of request. If you will not accept a gift, please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord." The request revealed how thoroughly his entire understanding of the world had been remade. He wanted to bring Israelite soil back to Damascus so that he could worship Israel's God while standing on Israel's earth. The man who had arrived seeking physical healing had found something deeper, a spiritual transformation that had changed everything about him. His final request showed the honest complexity of his new situation. "But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I bow down also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." Elisha understood the position of a man whose faith was new and whose official duties in a pagan court were unavoidable. "Go in peace," he said, giving his blessing to the man who would have to navigate carefully between a transformed heart and the obligations of royal service. Naaman departed with clean skin and a cleansed spirit, carrying Israelite earth and Israelite faith back to Syria with him. The little servant girl who had first mentioned the prophet watched him go, her compassionate suggestion having changed her master's life in ways she could never have fully imagined. Bones that breathe. Years moved through the land of Israel like quiet rivers. Elisha grew old in service to the God who had called him away from his plow decades before. His hair had gone white with age, his step had slowed, but his faith remained sure, and his reputation as a prophet continued drawing people from distant places who came seeking wisdom and miracles. The man who had received a double portion of Elijah's spirit had used it faithfully. Springs had been healed, armies had been delivered, widows had been sustained, children had been raised back from the edge of death. His life read like a living record of divine intervention in the ordinary affairs of human beings. But even prophets face mortality. The body that had carried God's power across so many decades began to show the deep wear of long service. Elisha felt his strength withdrawing like water from a cracked vessel. The time was drawing near when he would follow his master into the realm beyond earthly service. King Jehoash of Israel came to visit when word reached him that the prophet was ill. He was the grandson of Jehu, part of a royal line that had broken Ahab's house and swept Baal worship out of the northern kingdom. He found Elisha lying on his bed, clearly nearing the end of his time on earth. My father, the king cried out, using the same words Elisha himself had spoken when Elijah had been taken up in the whirlwind, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. He understood that losing this prophet would be the equivalent of losing an army's worth of divine protection. Even from his deathbed, Elisha continued serving as God's messenger. He gave the king specific instructions for confronting the Syrian threat, promising victories that would come after the prophet himself had gone to his rest. His final prophetic words carried genuine hope for Israel's future. When death finally arrived, it came with gentleness. No whirlwind descended to carry Elisha heavenward as one had done for Elijah. No fiery chariots swept down to take him into glory. He simply breathed his last breath and passed quietly into whatever lay beyond the veil between worlds. The entire nation felt the loss. From the royal court to the most modest village homes, people remembered how this gentle prophet had touched the life of their community. Stories were told and retold of his miracles, his wisdom, his deep compassion for the hurting and the helpless. They buried him in a tomb cut from rock, the kind of resting place kept for honored men. The entrance was sealed, and Elisha's earthly work appeared to be complete. His bones lay in the dark, waiting like all those who have died in faith. But God was not yet finished with his servant. The following spring brought Moabite raiding parties, as it did every year when weather made travel possible. These were not organized armies, but bands of robbers who swept across the border looking for quick plunder before retreating home. A group of Israelites was carrying out a burial when Moabite raiders appeared suddenly on the horizon. The funeral party panicked. They could not outrun mounted bandits while carrying a body. They needed to hide immediately or face capture, and worse. Elisha's tomb was nearby, its stone entrance standing partially open for some reason. Perhaps recent visitors had come to honor the prophet's memory. In their desperation, the mourners made a quick decision. They would hide the body they were burying in the nearest available space. They pushed the stone aside and lowered their dead companion into the prophet's resting place. There was no time for careful arrangement or respectful ceremony. They simply needed to get the body out of sight before the raiders arrived. The corpse came to rest against Elisha's bones in the darkness of the tomb. Dead flesh made contact with the remains of the man who had raised the dead throughout his living years. Power that had never departed from those bones flowed into the fresh corpse. Suddenly the dead man stood upright, alive and breathing. Death released its hold instantly and completely. The mourners stared in shock as their friend climbed out of the tomb under his own strength, bewildered but undeniably living. The Moabite raiders swept past, entirely unaware of what had just taken place. What appeared to them as a group of frightened people hiding from their advance was actually a gathering of witnesses to the final miracle of Elisha's entire ministry. Even in death, the prophet's bones carried the power of resurrection. The same God who had worked through his living hands continued working through his remains. Death itself had not been able to stop the flow of divine life that had defined his entire time on earth. The man who had been raised told his incredible story everywhere he went after that day. Word spread from village to village about the prophet whose very bones could pull the dead back into the living world. Elisha's reputation for miraculous power grew larger after his death than it had ever been while he was alive. People began making pilgrimages to the tomb, hoping to receive some measure of healing or blessing from the place where such power had been displayed. The cave holding the prophet's bones became a place of pilgrimage and remembrance, a sign to all who came that God's servants carry his authority even past the boundary of the grave. For the man who had been raised, ordinary life was never ordinary again. He had crossed the border between the living and the dead and had come back to tell about it. Every sunrise felt like a gift. Every breath felt like a miracle. Every single day became an opportunity to serve the God who had called him back. The resurrection also became a sign to all of Israel about the nature of the God they served. The nations surrounding them worshipped gods whose power stopped at the grave. But Israel's God ruled over death itself, perfectly capable of restoring life even through the bones of his faithful servants. Elisha's final miracle pointed forward to even greater resurrections still to come. If a prophet's bones could raise the dead, what might the power of God's own Son accomplish when he faced death and conquered it without remainder? The tomb in Israel became a quiet preview of an empty tomb in Jerusalem. The story crossed Israel's borders and reached the courts of foreign kings. A nation whose prophets left bones powerful enough to resurrect the dead clearly served a God worth taking seriously, one who commanded respect and inspired genuine awe in those who heard the report. Years continued passing, and the prophet's bones rested in their cave. But the power witnessed there lived on, in the memories and the faith of God's people. They had seen proof with their own eyes that their Creator was stronger than humanity's final enemy. When they came to face their own deaths, believers could remember the man who had touched Elisha's bones and walked back into the land of the living. If God could raise the dead through a prophet's remains, surely he could raise his own faithful servants when their time came to step through that final door. The bones of Elisha became a living symbol of hope that stretched beyond the grave. Death was not the end of the story for those who served a living God. Life would always have the final word, and resurrection was always possible for the one who had breathed life into dust from the very beginning. In the darkness of that sealed tomb, surrounded by the silence of death, power moved from old bones into fresh flesh and turned the longest night any man had ever known into a new morning. The miracle was quiet, witnessed by only a few, but its meaning echoed through eternity.